The year was 1962. In the unforgiving heart of Mateman, West Virginia, 17 souls descended into the suffocating maw of the Blackwater mine for their morning shift. They chased the promise of coal, unaware they walked into a tomb. Not one of them would ever return. The official verdict arrived swiftly. A catastrophic methane explosion, an unforgiving beast that collapsed 3 tunnels, entombing the miners within. The company, Cumberland Coal, settled with grieving families. The mine, a symbol of shared sorrow, was sealed, forever silencing its secrets. Mateman, a town steeped in coal dust and resilience, began the arduous task of healing. But 50 years later, the past refused to stay buried. Sheriff Danny Morrison, a man etched with the quiet determination of the mountains, stumbled upon a truth that clawed its way from the dusty archives of Mingo County. A sealed room deep within the earth, untouched by the supposed explosion. What he unearthed within its forgotten confines would shatter 50 years of carefully constructed lies, forcing him to pry open a case that powerful men had buried with brutal efficiency. Some secrets, he would learn, are far deadlier when unearthed, especially when they lie closest to home. For 3 long years, Sheriff Danny Morrison had dodged the task of clearing out the old file room, a cavern of forgotten histories. But the arrival of the new computer system demanded action. Every brittle page, every faded report, every whispered past had to be sorted, scanned, or consigned to the flames of history. It was a chore he tackled in stolen moments, long after his official duties ceased, when the county building hummed with an almost reverent silence, allowing him to think. The basement storage room was a mausoleum of forgotten scents, dust, decaying paper, and the ghost of forgotten lives. Boxes stacked precariously from floor to ceiling chronicled decades of mundane bureaucracy, stretching back to the 1940s. Most contained the predictable clutter of small-town law enforcement, property disputes, minor arrests, budget reports destined for oblivion. Yet Danny was a man of meticulous nature, a cop who consumed every word, every detail, before rendering judgment on a document's fate. It was this unwavering thoroughness that led him to it, a file, thick with the weight of untold stories, simply marked Blackwater Mine Incident, 1962. The folder lay wedged, a forgotten shard of tragedy, between a stack of obsolete traffic citations and a box of courthouse maintenance records. Danny knew the story, had heard it whispered in hushed tones since childhood. 17 miners swallowed by an explosion, the darkest day in Matewan's scarred history. His own grandfather, a man of few words and calloused hands, had toiled in the mines before turning to construction, a safer yet less lucrative path. He'd always spoken of the danger, but also of the good pay, a lifeline for men with limited choices in these mountains. Danny carefully extracted the file, placing it on the old wooden table he'd claimed as his temporary workspace. The incident report, a relic of a bygone era, was brittle and yellowed with age, its words imprinted by a worn typewriter, the letters faded, struggling against the march of time. The header proudly declared, Mingo County Sheriff's Department. The date stamped below, April 23, 1962. Location, Blackwater Mine, Route 52, Matewan, West Virginia. Incident type, industrial accident, multiple fatalities. The report coolly detailed a methane gas explosion occurring at approximately 11:47 a.m. in the mine's eastern section. 17 miners had been underground. All were presumed dead. Tunnels collapsed. Rescue teams thwarted. Hope extinguished. Then came the list, each name a cold, sharp blade twisting in Danny's gut. 17 names, 17 men who never saw home again, 17 families shattered in a single brutal morning. But one name seized his breath, freezing the blood in his veins. Morrison, James Patrick Morrison, age 31, lead foreman. Morrison. His grandfather, James Patrick Morrison? A cold dread coiled in Danny's stomach. His grandfather had passed when Danny was 12, a heart attack, the family had said. The mines, it seemed, had always been a forbidden topic, a whispered secret. His father had always maintained that Grandpa worked construction, built houses, kept his hands clean of the earth's dangerous embrace. Yet here it was, undeniable, inscribed in an official report, his grandfather, listed as the lead foreman of the very crew annihilated in the Blackwater mine explosion. Danny frantically thumbed through the remaining pages, hungry for details, desperate for an explanation. Photographs emerged, stark black and white images of the mine entrance, rescue equipment, officials in ill-fitting suits, their faces grim, addressing a throng of reporters. But it was a handwritten note, clipped to the back of the incident report, that truly seized his attention. Investigation incomplete. Recommend further inquiry into company safety protocols and timeline of events. Several discrepancies noted in witness statements. Deputy R. Collins. Below it, in a different authoritative hand, chillingly succinct. Case closed by order of Sheriff Hawkins. No further investigation required. Danny stared, a chilling realization dawning. Someone had tried to dig deeper, only to be silenced. Why? Why would a sheriff, a man sworn to uphold the law, shut down an investigation into 17 deaths? He continued to read. The next document was a settlement agreement, a terse, legalistic pact between Cumberland Coal Company and the families of the victims. Each family had received a paltry $5,000, a significant sum in 1962 perhaps, but a pittance against the immeasurable loss of a husband, a father. What struck Danny, however, was the bewildering speed of the settlement. The explosion had ripped through the mine on April 23rd. By May 15th, less than 3 weeks later, every family had signed, every claim resolved, the mine permanently sealed. Danny, with 15 years of industrial accident investigations under his belt, knew the glacial pace of such resolutions. Months, often years of legal wrangling. Companies fought payouts tooth and nail. Insurance agencies demanded exhaustive inquiries. Families, shattered and enraged, hired lawyers, filed lawsuits. Yet the Blackwater mine case had been wrapped up in less than a month. At the bottom of the file, a thick manila envelope, ominously marked Evidence, Property of Cumberland Coal Company. Inside, what appeared to be geological survey reports, pages dense with technical diagrams, inscrutable mineral composition analyses. Danny, a cop, not a geologist, struggled to decipher them, but one phrase, stark and unnerving, recurred throughout. High-grade uranium ore deposits. Estimated value $2.3 million per ton. Danny leaned back in his chair, the pieces of a dark puzzle clicking into place. In 1962, uranium was more than just a mineral. It was gold. It was power. It was the raw, terrifying heart of the Cold War. Nuclear weapons programs devoured it, transforming it into a strategic resource of unparalleled value. If the Blackwater mine held uranium worth millions per ton, the narrative of a simple industrial accident crumbled. This wasn't just a tragedy. It was potentially a meticulously orchestrated cover-up, a brutal sacrifice to conceal an unimaginable fortune in mineral wealth. His radio crackled to life, yanking him back to the present, making him jump. "Sheriff Morrison, you copy?" He keyed the mic. "Go ahead, dispatch." "Got a call from the State Mining Inspector's office. They want to schedule a meeting about some old mine safety records for a federal audit. Should I set something up?" Danny's gaze fell to the damning file splayed across his desk, to his grandfather's name on the list of the dead, to the uranium surveys that had never seen the light of day. "Tell them I'll call them back," he said, his voice measured. "I need to look into something first."
As he hung up the radio, a cold resolve settled in Danny Morrison's heart. He was going to the Blackwater mine. He was going to stand on the ground where his grandfather had supposedly died 50 years ago, because something was profoundly, terrifyingly wrong with this file. And in 15 years of police work, Danny had learned that when official stories moved too fast, when tragedies settled too easily, there were usually secrets worth unearthing. He gathered the files, securing them in his truck, and set out onto Route 52. The Blackwater mine was a mere 20-minute drive from town, yet Danny had never set foot there. There had been no reason to visit the site of a half-century-old tragedy. But as his patrol car wound through the sinuous mountain roads, a chilling certainty began to form. His grandfather hadn't died the way his family believed, and if that was true, then 17 other families had been fed a lie. The question clawed at him. Who had lied, and what monstrous truth had they sought to bury? The entrance gate hung open, a gaping rusted maw on sagging hinges. A faded sign, a ghostly testament to corporate ownership, was still visible. Cumberland Coal Company, authorized personnel only. Below it, someone had spray-painted a stark, urgent warning. "Danger, keep out." The red letters bleeding down the metal like dried blood.
Danny parked beside the gate, stepping out into the profound silence of the mountains. The air was a blend of pine and old coal dust, underscored by a persistent dampness that seemed to seep from the earth itself. 50 years of weather had softened the brutal industrial scars, yet the skeletal remains of the operation were starkly visible. Concrete foundations where buildings once stood, rusted rail tracks that had once ferried laden coal cars, and in the distance, the dark, sealed mouth of the mine shaft, barricaded behind a formidable wall of concrete and steel. He walked up the gravel road, his boots crunching on stones intermingled with coal fragments that still littered the ground, black tears shed by the earth. The deeper he ventured into the site, the more a profound sense of unease settled upon him. Danny had seen his share of abandoned mines, places shuttered due to economic downturns or environmental mandates. Those sites wore their decay with a certain resignation. Equipment left where it fell, buildings slowly stripped of valuable materials, a gradual, natural surrender to time. But the Blackwater mine felt different. It felt like it had been abandoned in a panic, a hasty flight from something terrible. Near the skeletal remains of what was once the main office building, Denny found scattered papers, half buried beneath decades of fallen leaves. Most were too water-damaged, too brittle to read, but he could decipher fragments, timesheets, safety reports, personnel records, the kind of vital paperwork companies usually secured or incinerated upon closure. More disturbing was what he discovered near the sealed mine entrance, a formidable barrier of concrete blocks and steel reinforcement, far more extensive than any standard mine closure. This wasn't merely securing a dangerous shaft. This was an act of absolute determination, a desperate effort to ensure that nothing, or no one could ever enter or exit again. Danny circled the perimeter of the seal, studying its construction. The concrete was poured thick, massive steel beams welded across the opening in a crisscross pattern. But it was the dates, starkly stamped into the concrete at ground level, that seized his attention. April 24th, 1962, and April 25th, 1962. The day after the reported explosion, and the day after that. A frown creased Danny's brow. According to the official report he'd read, rescue operations had supposedly continued for several agonizing days, teams battling against the collapsed tunnels to reach the trapped miners. But if they had begun sealing the mine entrance less than 24 hours after the incident, how could any genuine rescue attempt have been made? He pulled out his phone, snapping photos of the concrete dates, the heavy steel reinforcement, the scattered paperwork. Then he walked back toward his patrol car, his mind a swirling vortex of unanswered questions. Why the rapid sealing? Why the abrupt halt to the sheriff's investigation? Why had his family never spoken of his grandfather's true fate? And most ominously, what secrets had this particular mine harbored that were valuable enough to extinguish 17 lives? Danny was halfway back to his car when he saw him, a figure watching from the tree line. 60 yards away, perhaps, partially obscured by a cluster of ancient pine trees. Tall, gaunt, dressed in worn work clothes, a baseball cap pulled low, shadowing his face. When Danny raised a hand in a questioning wave, the man retreated, melting deeper into the woods. "Hey," Danny called out, his voice sharp against the mountain quiet. "You need something?" No response. The man vanished as if he'd never been there. Danny's hand moved instinctively to his service weapon. 15 years in law enforcement had honed his instincts, a sixth sense for when a situation teetered on the edge of danger. There was something about the way the man had watched him, patient, careful, like someone intimately familiar with concealment, that set off a clamor of internal alarms. Danny walked quickly back to his patrol car, his eye scanning the tree line. As he got in and started the engine, his radio crackled. "Sheriff Morrison, you there? Go ahead. Got a call from someone asking about your location. Said he was from the state mining office. Wanted to know if you were investigating old mine sites today." Danny's chest tightened. Did he give a name? Said his name was Henderson, but when I asked for a callback number, he just said he'd call back later and hung up. Danny glanced back toward the tree line where the man had been watching. No state mining inspector would be lurking in the woods at an abandoned mine site. And how could anyone have known he was here? "Copy," Danny said, his voice tight. "I'm heading back to the office." But as he drove away from the Blackwater mine, Danny couldn't shake the chilling certainty that his visit had triggered something dormant. Someone was watching the site. Someone who deeply resented law enforcement poking around in 50-year-old accident scenes. Back in the sterile confines of the sheriff's office, Danny spread the Blackwater mine file across his desk like an autopsy report. The first call went to the West Virginia Department of Mining Safety. "I need to speak to someone about historical mine records," he told the receptionist. "Hold, please." After a series of transfers, Danny found himself speaking to Betty Mason, a records clerk whose voice carried the authority of 3 decades spent among dusty archives. "Blackwater Mine," she repeated, the name echoing vaguely in her memory as Danny explained his quest. "That name sounds familiar, but I can't place it. What year did you say?" 1962, an explosion that killed 17 miners. Let me check our database. Danny heard the rhythmic clatter of keys in the background. That's strange. I'm not finding any incident reports for a Blackwater mine in 1962. Are you sure about the name and date? Danny stared at the county incident report splayed on his desk. I'm holding the county sheriff's incident report right now. 17 miners killed in a methane explosion on April 23, 1962. Sir, I've been maintaining these records for 3 decades. We have documentation for every mine fatality in West Virginia going back to the 1920s. If 17 miners died in 1962, there would definitely be a state investigation file, but there isn't one. No, sir. According to our database, there was no mining incident involving multiple fatalities in Mingo County in 1962. A cold dread snaked its way up Danny's spine. What about Cumberland Coal Company? Do you have any records for them operating mines in the Matewan area? More typing. I show Cumberland Coal Company operating several mines in southern West Virginia in the 1960s. But this is odd. Their Matewan operation shows a closure date of April 22, 1962, 1 day before your reported incident. They closed the mine the day before the explosion? Danny's voice was barely a whisper. According to our records, yes. And, sir, the closure was listed as administrative, no reason given.
Danny thanked Betty Mason and hung up, his mind a whirlwind. The state had no record of the explosion. Cumberland Coal had officially closed the mine the day before it supposedly happened. And someone was still watching the site 50 years later. He picked up the phone again and dialed his father's number. Dad, I need to ask you about Grandpa. A moment of quiet on the other end. What about him? His father's voice, cautious. How did he really die? Another pause, longer this time, thick with unspoken history. Danny, why are you asking about this now? Because I found a file that says he was killed in a mine explosion in 1962, along with 16 other men. But you always told me he died of a heart attack. His father's voice dropped, barely audible. Where did you find this file? In the county records. Dad, what really happened to him? Son, there are some things that are better left buried. Your grandfather wouldn't want you digging into this. 17 men died, Dad. 17 families were lied to. If Grandpa was one of them, Danny. His father's voice was sharp, a rare edge of anger. Now drop this. Trust me, some stones are better left unturned. The line went dead.
Danny stared at the phone, his father's warning echoing in the quiet office. But as he looked at his grandfather's name on the victim list, at the uranium surveys in the evidence envelope, at the photos he'd taken of the hastily sealed mine entrance, he knew he couldn't let it go. 17 men had died. Their families had been paid off, silenced. And 50 years later, someone was still watching, still making sure the truth stayed buried. Sheriff Danny Morrison was about to find out why. Danny spent the remainder of the afternoon chasing ghosts, tirelessly tracking down the families of the other 16 miners listed in the incident report. Many of the surnames resonated with the familiar cadence of Matewan, names he'd seen on mailboxes, heard at town council meetings, families whose descendants still anchored themselves to the mountain soil. But with each call, he slammed into the same impenetrable wall of silence and disappearance. Henderson family? Oh, they moved away years ago, right after old Bill died, I think. The Caldwells? Haven't seen any of them since I was a kid. Heard they went up north somewhere. Bobby Garrett's family? They used to live on Elm Street, but the house has been empty for decades. By 5 o'clock, Danny had made 23 calls and found exactly 0 living relatives of the Blackwater Mine victims. In a town where families were rooted deep, generations old, where everyone knew everyone else's business for the past half-century, somehow all the families connected to the worst mining disaster in local history had simply vanished. It wasn't normal. It wasn't even possible. Danny locked the files in his desk and drove home, but the enigma clung to him like the scent of coal dust. He lived in a small, unassuming house on the outskirts of town, the kind of place where thoughts could unfurl without interruption. After a dinner he barely tasted, he settled onto his back porch, a cold beer in hand, his laptop glowing in the encroaching twilight. He dove into the internet, a digital archaeologist sifting for traces of the missing families. What he uncovered was deeply disturbing. Public records revealed that 6 of the 17 families had sold their homes and moved out of state within 6 months of the mine incident. 3 more had relocated within West Virginia, but to counties far removed from Matawan. The remaining 8 families had simply ceased to exist in the records. No forwarding addresses, no death certificates, no trace of their fates. Danny had investigated enough missing persons cases to know that entire families didn't just vanish without leaving a paper trail. People had social security numbers, tax records, medical files. Someone always knew something. But the families of the Blackwater Mine victims had been erased as thoroughly as if they'd never existed. His phone rang, jarring him from his grim research. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number. Sheriff Morrison. That's right. My name is Carl Hutchkins. I heard you've been asking questions about the old mine incident. Danny sat up straighter. Who told you that? Word travels fast in a small town, Sheriff. I was wondering if we could meet and talk. There are some things you should know before you dig too deep into this. What kind of things? The kind that got a lot of good people hurt back in 1962? The kind that could still get people hurt today? Danny felt his pulse quicken. Are you threatening me, Mr. Hutchkins? No, sir. I'm trying to warn you. There's a difference. Where do you want to meet? You know the old diner on Route 119, about 10 miles north of town? I'll be there at 8. Come alone, and don't tell anyone where you're going. The line went dead before Danny could respond.
Danny stared at his phone, every instinct screaming that this was a terrible idea. Meeting unknown contacts in isolated locations was precisely the kind of scenario that ended with law enforcement officers in the ground. But Carl Hutchkins had information about the mine incident, and Danny needed answers more than he needed safety. He holstered his service weapon, grabbed his truck keys, and headed out into the mountain darkness. The diner on Route 119 had been closed for years, a relic of forgotten times, yet its parking lot lights still dutifully cast sickly yellow pools of illumination across the cracked asphalt. Danny arrived 15 minutes early, sweeping the area with a practiced eye, searching for any hint of an ambush or unseen vehicles. The place appeared deserted, save for a single, nondescript pickup truck parked near the diner's entrance. Precisely at 8 o'clock, a man emerged from the deep shadows near the building. He was probably in his 70s, his white hair a stark contrast to the kind of weathered face that only decades of outdoor toil can etch. He moved with a careful, almost stiff gait, like someone whose joints had seen better days, yet his eyes, even in the dim light, were sharp, alert. Sheriff Morrison? Mr. Hutchkins. They shook hands. Danny noted the man's grip, still surprisingly strong despite his age. Thank you for coming, Hutchkins said, his voice raspy. I wasn't sure you would. You said you had information about the mine incident. Hutchkins nodded, gesturing toward a dilapidated picnic table near the edge of the parking lot. Let's sit. This is going to take a while. They settled across from each other. Hutchkins pulled a thermos from his jacket pocket. Coffee. I'm good. Talk to me about 1962. Hutchkins poured himself a cup, taking a long, contemplative sip before speaking. I was 22 years old then, worked at the mine for about 3 years, usually on the day shift, but on April 23rd, I called in sick. Danny felt his pulse quicken. You were supposed to be working the day of the explosion? Should have been down there with the rest of them. James Morrison was my shift supervisor. Good man, fair boss. If I hadn't had food poisoning that morning, I'd be dead too. So you believe the explosion really happened? Hutchkins laughed, a harsh, bitter sound devoid of humor. Sheriff, there was no explosion. The words hung in the night air, heavy and solid. Danny leaned forward, his voice a strained whisper. What do you mean? I mean, those 17 men didn't die in any methane blast. They were murdered, shot down in the tunnels like dogs, and then buried behind concrete and steel so nobody could ever find the bodies. Danny's mouth went dry. How do you know this?
Because I saw it happen. Hutchkins set down his coffee cup, looking Danny directly in the eye. I may have called in sick, but I couldn't sleep that morning. Felt guilty about leaving my crew short-handed. So around noon, I drove out to the mine to see if they needed me for the afternoon shift. He paused, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up the thermos again. When I got there, I heard gunshots coming from underground. Not 1 or 2 shots, a lot of them, like a war was happening down in those tunnels. What did you do? Hid behind one of the equipment sheds and waited. About 20 minutes later, men started coming up from the mine. Not miners, men in suits, carrying rifles. And behind them came more men in work clothes, but they weren't Cumberland Coal employees. I'd never seen any of them before. Danny pulled out his notebook. How many men? 8 or 10, maybe more. They spent the next 2 hours bringing up equipment, files, boxes of stuff, loading it all into trucks that weren't marked with any company names. Did you recognize anyone? Hutchkins nodded grimly. Harold Vance, the Cumberland Coal General Supervisor, and Sheriff Hawkins, both of them armed, both of them giving orders like they were running the show. Ice trickled through Danny's veins. The sheriff, involved up to his neck. I watched him personally supervise the concrete trucks when they came to seal the mine entrance. Must have been 6 or 7 loads of concrete, way more than you'd need just to close a shaft. Why didn't you report what you saw? Hutchkins laughed again, the sound hollow. To who? The sheriff's department? Harold Vance owned half the county commissioners, and Sheriff, you have to understand, this was 1962. The Cold War was hot. The government had all kinds of black projects running, and people who asked too many questions had a way of disappearing. Danny studied the old man's face in the parking lot lights. But you're telling me now, because I'm 73 years old, and I've been carrying this secret for 50 years. Because those 17 men had families who deserved to know the truth. And because... Hutchkins hesitated. Because what? Because they're still out there, Sheriff. The people who ordered those killings, maybe not the same individuals, but the same organizations, the same interests. And if you keep digging into this, they're going to come for you the same way they came for anyone else who got too close to the truth. Danny leaned back, his mind reeling. Mr. Hutchkins, if what you're telling me is true, we're talking about mass murder and a conspiracy involving local law enforcement and federal agencies. That's exactly what I'm telling you. Why should I believe you?
Hutchkins reached into his jacket and pulled out a small metal object, setting it on the picnic table between them. It was a brass shell casing,
tarnished with age but still clearly marked with caliber and manufacturer information. "I picked this up outside the mine entrance that day," Hutchkins said. "Figured someday someone might need proof that those men were shot, not killed in any explosion." Danny picked up the shell casing, turning it over in his hands. It was .30-06 caliber, military issue, the kind of ammunition used in government-issued rifles. "There's something else," Hutchkins added, "something that might help you understand why they were willing to kill 17 men to keep it secret." He pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. "I managed to grab this from one of the boxes they were loading into the trucks." Geological Survey Report. Danny unfolded the paper, reading by the faint glow of his phone. The document was technical, dense with mining terminology he didn't understand, but one section was circled in bold red ink. High-grade uranium ore, concentration 2.7% by weight. Estimated reserves 47,000 tons. Current market value $127 million. Danny whistled low. $127 million in 1962! "Worth maybe 10 times that in today's money," Hutchkins said. "And Sheriff, that was just the uranium. There were other minerals down there too, rare earth elements that were even more valuable for weapons research." Danny folded the paper carefully, tucking it into his jacket pocket along with the shell casing. "Mr. Hutchkins, if you've had this evidence for 50 years, why didn't you ever—" "Because they killed anyone who tried," Hutchkins said. 3 months after the mine incident, Deputy Collins, the one who wanted to investigate further, died in a car accident on a straight stretch of road he'd driven 1,000 times. 6 months later, a newspaper reporter from Charleston who was asking questions about the mine died of a sudden heart attack at age 31. A year later, Harold Vance's own secretary disappeared completely after someone saw her photocopying company files.
Danny felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. They've been killing people to cover this up for 50 years. Anyone who got too close to the truth. Sheriff, I'm telling you this because those 17 men deserve justice. But I'm also telling you because if you're not careful, you're going to be number 18. As if summoned by Hutchkins' ominous words, headlights appeared on Route 119, moving slowly toward the diner. Both men watched as a dark sedan pulled into the parking lot, stopping about 50 yards away, its engine humming, the driver remaining unseen within. "Time for me to go," Hutchkins said, standing up quickly. "Sheriff, be very careful who you trust. This conspiracy has roots in places you wouldn't expect." "Wait," Danny said. "How do I contact you if I need more information?" But Hutchkins was already walking toward his truck. "You don't. After tonight, Carl Hutchkins is going to disappear, just like those 17 families did. It's the only way to stay alive." He got in his truck and drove off, leaving Danny alone in the parking lot with a dark sedan and a shell casing that screamed a terrible truth. 17 men had been murdered for a uranium deposit worth over $1 billion in today's money. The sedan's dark door opened, and a man in a suit stepped out. Danny's hand moved to his service weapon as the man walked slowly across the parking lot toward him. "Sheriff Morrison," the man called out, his voice calm, authoritative, "I think we need to talk." The man in the suit was younger than Danny expected, perhaps 45, with the kind of clean-cut appearance that screamed federal agent. He moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to controlling situations, his hands visible but poised for quick action. "Agent James Crawford, FBI," he said, flashing a badge wallet. "Mind if we have a conversation?" Danny kept his hand near his weapon. "Depends on what kind of conversation you have in mind. The kind where I explain why poking around in 50-year-old mining accidents might not be in your best interest or the best interest of your community. Is that a threat, Agent Crawford?" Crawford smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "It's practical advice from someone who knows more about the Blackwater situation than you do." Danny studied the man's face in the parking lot lights. "How did you know I was here?" "We've been monitoring communications related to the Blackwater mine since this morning. Your phone calls to the state mining office triggered some automated flags in our system." "Your system? What system would that be?" Crawford gestured toward the picnic table where Danny had been sitting with Hutchkins. "Mind if we sit? This might take a few minutes."
Against his better judgment, Danny nodded. They sat across from each other. Crawford pulled a manila folder from his jacket. "Sheriff Morrison, what I'm about to tell you is classified information that I'm sharing with you as a professional courtesy. The Blackwater mine incident in 1962 was part of a federal operation related to national security interests during the Cold War." "What kind of operation?" Crawford opened the folder, revealing a document with heavy black redactions obscuring most of the text. "Uranium extraction for weapons development. The miners who died weren't victims of an industrial accident. They were casualties of a necessary operation to secure strategic materials for the defense of the United States." Anger simmered in Danny's chest. "You're telling me the federal government murdered 17 miners? I'm telling you that during the Cold War, difficult decisions had to be made to protect national security. The uranium deposits at Blackwater were critical to our nuclear weapons program. When the miners discovered the true nature of what they were extracting, they became a security risk. So you killed them." Crawford's expression remained unchanged. "The operation was carried out by contractors working under federal authority. The miners were offered relocation packages to other parts of the country, with new identities and financial compensation. Most accepted. Some didn't." Danny pulled out his notebook. "Carl Hutchkins said he saw men with rifles coming up from the mine. He said he heard gunshots."
Crawford closed the folder. Carl Hutchkins is a 73-year-old man whose memory of events from 50 years ago may not be entirely reliable. There were no gunshots, Sheriff. There was no mass murder. There was a controlled relocation of civilian personnel who had access to classified information. Then why was my grandfather listed as dead in the county incident report? Because James Morrison refused relocation. He insisted on staying in Matewan, continuing to work at the mine, potentially compromising the entire operation. He was given multiple opportunities to accept the relocation package. Crawford leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Your grandfather was a patriot, Sheriff, but he was also stubborn. When he threatened to go public with information about the uranium extraction, difficult decisions had to be made." Danny felt like he'd been punched in the stomach. "You killed my grandfather because he wouldn't keep quiet about a government mining operation? Your grandfather died in service to his country, just like soldiers who die in classified missions overseas. The difference is, we couldn't give him a medal or a military funeral without compromising national security." Danny stood up abruptly. "You murdered 17 miners and covered it up." Crawford remained seated, his voice unnervingly calm. "Sheriff, I understand this is difficult information to process, but you need to understand the bigger picture here. The uranium extracted from Blackwater Mine was used to build nuclear weapons that helped end the Cold War and protect American lives for decades. By killing American citizens? By making hard choices in difficult times?" Crawford stood and closed his folder.
The same kinds of hard choices that are still being made today to protect national security.
Danny felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Is that why you're here? To make sure I make the right choice? I'm here to offer you the same opportunity your grandfather was given. Walk away from this investigation, and your family stays safe. Your career continues uninterrupted. Life goes on as normal. And if I don't walk away? Crawford smiled again, and this time there was something predatory in his expression. Sheriff, you're investigating the deaths of 17 men who supposedly died 50 years ago. If something were to happen to you during that investigation, an accident at an abandoned mine site, maybe a structural collapse in an old tunnel, it would be a tragic but understandable occupational hazard. Danny's hand moved to his service weapon. Now that definitely sounds like a threat. It's a reality check, Crawford said. The people who ordered the Blackwater operation are still alive, still in positions of power, still making decisions about national security. They've spent 50 years protecting this secret, and they're not going to let a small-town sheriff expose it now. Crawford walked back toward his sedan, then turned around. You have 24 hours to decide, Sheriff. After that, the offer expires. What offer? The offer to walk away and live a long, quiet life. Crawford got in his car and rolled down the window. Oh, and Sheriff, Carl Hutchins won't be available.
The sedan pulled away, its taillights receding into the darkness, leaving Danny alone in the vast, echoing parking lot. In his pocket, the brass shell casing felt heavy, a stark, tangible proof of murder. 17 men, he knew now, had been brutally sacrificed for a uranium deposit worth over $1 billion in today's money. The driver's side door of the sedan reopened, and a man in a crisp suit stepped out. Danny's hand, already at his service weapon, instinctively drew it as the figure advanced slowly across the asphalt. "Sheriff Morrison," the man's voice cut through the stillness, "I believe we need to speak." The suit-clad man was younger than Danny had anticipated, perhaps mid-40s, with a meticulously groomed appearance that screamed federal agent. He moved with the assured stride of someone perpetually in control, his hands visible yet poised for swift action. "Agent James Crawford, FBI," he announced, presenting a badge wallet. "Care to have a conversation?" Danny kept his hand firmly on his weapon. "That depends," he replied, his gaze unwavering, "on the nature of this conversation you have in mind." "The kind," Crawford elaborated, a subtle edge to his voice, "that I elucidate why meddling in 50-year-old mining accidents might not serve your best interests, nor those of your community." "Is that a veiled threat, Agent Crawford?" Crawford's lips curved into a smile that failed to reach his eyes. "Consider it practical counsel, Sheriff, from someone intimately familiar with the Blackwater situation." Danny scrutinized the man's face under the flickering parking lot lights. "How did you become aware of my presence here?" "We initiated monitoring of all communications pertinent to the Blackwater mine this morning," Crawford explained. "Your calls to the state mining office triggered automated alerts in our system." "Your system?" Danny scoffed. "And what system would that be?" Crawford gestured towards the picnic table, where Danny had just spoken with Hutchins. "Mind if we sit? This may require a few minutes." Against his better judgment, Danny nodded. They took seats opposite each other, and Crawford produced a manila folder from his jacket. "Sheriff Morrison," he began, his voice low and deliberate, "what I am about to disclose is classified information, shared with you purely as a professional courtesy. The Blackwater mine incident of 1962 was an integral part of a federal operation, directly linked to national security interests during the height of the Cold War." "What kind of operation?"
Crawford opened the folder, revealing a document heavily redacted with stark black lines, obscuring most of the text. Uranium extraction for weapons development. The miners who perished were not victims of an industrial accident. They were casualties of a necessary operation to secure strategic materials vital to the defense of the United States. A surge of hot anger swelled in Danny's chest. "Are you asserting that the federal government murdered 17 miners?" "I am asserting, Sheriff," Crawford stated calmly, "that during the Cold War, difficult decisions were regrettably unavoidable to safeguard national security. The Blackwater mine deposits were paramount to our nuclear weapons program. When the miners inadvertently stumbled upon the true nature of their extraction, they became an unacceptable security risk." "So," Danny spat, the word laced with disgust, "you murdered them."
Crawford's expression remained utterly impassive. The operation was executed by contractors operating under federal authority. The miners were extended relocation packages to other regions of the country, complete with new identities and significant financial compensation. Most accepted, some did not. Danny pulled out his notebook. Carl Hutchkins claims he witnessed men with rifles emerging from the mine. He claims he heard gunshots. Crawford closed the folder. Carl Hutchkins is a 73-year-old man whose recollection of events from half a century ago may not be entirely accurate. There were no gunshots, Sheriff. There was no mass murder. There was a controlled relocation of civilian personnel who had access to classified information. "Then why," Danny challenged, his voice rising, "was my grandfather listed as dead in the county incident report?"
"Because James Morrison refused relocation," Crawford explained, his tone unwavering. "He insisted on remaining in Matewan, continuing his work at the mine, thereby potentially jeopardizing the entire operation. He was afforded multiple opportunities to accept the relocation package." Crawford leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Your grandfather was a patriot, Sheriff, but he was also profoundly stubborn. When he threatened to disclose information regarding the uranium extraction, difficult decisions had to be made. A physical blow could not have stunned Danny more." You killed my grandfather because he wouldn't keep quiet about a government mining operation?" "Your grandfather," Crawford corrected, his voice resonating with a disturbing conviction, "died in service to his country, no differently than soldiers who fall in classified missions overseas. The distinction is we could not bestow upon him a medal or a military funeral without compromising national security." Danny shot to his feet abruptly. "You murdered 17 miners and orchestrated a cover-up."
Crawford remained seated, his voice unnervingly calm. "Sheriff, I appreciate that this is challenging information to process. However, you must comprehend the larger context. The uranium extracted from Blackwater Mine was instrumental in forging nuclear weapons that ultimately helped conclude the Cold War and preserved American lives for decades. By executing American citizens," Danny retorted, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief, "by making difficult choices in difficult times," Crawford concluded, rising to his feet and closing his folder with a decisive snap. "The very same arduous choices that are still being made today, all in the name of national security." A chill, far colder than the mountain air, permeated Danny to his very core. "Is that," he questioned, his voice barely a whisper, "why you're truly here? To ensure I make the right choice?" "I am here," Crawford reiterated, his eyes locking with Danny's, "to extend to you the same opportunity your grandfather was given. Disengage from this investigation, and your family will remain safe. Your career will continue uninterrupted. Life will proceed as normal. And if I refuse to disengage?"
Crawford's smile returned, and this time it was utterly predatory. "Sheriff, you are investigating the purported deaths of 17 men from 50 years ago. Should an unfortunate accident befall you during this investigation, perhaps a mishap at an abandoned mine, a structural collapse within an old tunnel, it would be a tragic yet entirely comprehensible occupational hazard." Danny's hand moved decisively to his service weapon. "Now that," he stated, his voice hard, "sounds precisely like a threat." "It is a reality check," Crawford clarified, his gaze unblinking. "The individuals who sanctioned the Blackwater operation are still alive, still wield significant power, and still make critical decisions concerning national security. They have expended 50 years safeguarding this secret, and they will not permit a small-town sheriff to expose it now." Crawford turned and walked back towards his sedan. As he reached the vehicle, he paused, turning to face Danny once more. "You have 24 hours to make your decision, Sheriff. After that, the offer expires." "What offer?" Danny demanded, a knot forming in his stomach. "The offer," he responded, his voice chillingly detached as he got into his car and rolled down the window, "to simply walk away and live a long, quiet life." He paused, a flicker of something malevolent in his eyes. "Oh, and Sheriff, Carl Hutchkins," he added with a dismissive wave, "won't be available for any further conversations." The sedan pulled away, its taillights shrinking into the void of the night, leaving Danny utterly alone in the vast, echoing parking lot. The brass shell casing in his pocket now felt impossibly heavy, a tangible, chilling proof of mass murder. 17 men, he knew with absolute certainty, had been brutally sacrificed for a uranium deposit worth well over $1 billion in today's market. Back at the sheriff's office, Danny meticulously spread the Blackwater mine file across his desk. The yellowed incident report, his grandfather's name among the dead, the geological surveys hinting at unimaginable wealth, the shell casings, and the photos of the hastily sealed mine entrance. Each piece of evidence screamed a truth that defied the official narrative. His first call was to the West Virginia Department of Mining Safety. "I need to speak to someone about historical mine records," he told the receptionist. After a series of transfers, he found himself connected to Betty Mason, a records clerk who had dedicated 30 years to the department. "Blackwater Mine?" Betty repeated, her voice tinny over the phone when Danny explained his query. "That name, it sounds familiar, but I can't quite place it. What year did you say?" 1962, an explosion that claimed 17 miners' lives. A pause followed, punctuated by the faint tap-tap-tap of keys in the background. That's peculiar," Betty eventually said. "I'm finding no incident reports for a Blackwater mine in 1962. Are you certain of the name and date, Sheriff?"
Danny stared at the file splayed before him. "I am holding the county sheriff's official incident report right now. 17 miners killed in a methane explosion on April 23, 1962. Sir, Betty's voice hardened with decades of institutional knowledge. I have maintained these records for 3 decades. We possess documentation for every mine fatality in West Virginia dating back to the 1920s. If 17 miners had perished in 1962, there would undeniably be a state investigation file. But there isn't one. No, sir. According to our database, there was no mining incident involving multiple fatalities in Mingo County in 1962. A cold, creeping sensation snaked up Danny's spine. What about Cumberland Coal Company? Do you have any records of their operations in the Metuan area? More typing. I show Cumberland Coal Company operating several mines in southern West Virginia in the 1960s, but this is odd. Their Metuan operation shows a closure date of April 22, 1962, one day before your reported incident. They officially closed the mine the day before the explosion? Danny asked, his mind reeling. According to our records, yes. And, sir, the closure was listed as administrative. No reason provided. Danny thanked Betty Mason and hung up, his thoughts a chaotic whirlwind. The state had no record of the explosion. Cumberland Coal had officially ceased operations at the mine the day before it supposedly happened, and someone, 50 years later, was still diligently watching the site. He picked up the phone again, dialing his father's number. "Dad, I need to ask you about Grandpa." A moment of silence stretched across the line. "What about him?" his father finally asked, his voice laced with an unfamiliar caution. "How did he truly die?" Another longer pause. "Danny," his father's voice was strained, "why are you asking about this now?" "Because I found a file that states he was killed in a mine explosion in 1962, alongside 16 other men. But you always told me he died of a heart attack." His father's voice dropped to a near whisper, heavy with unspoken burdens. "Where did you unearth this file?" "In the county records. Dad, please, what really happened to him?" "Son," his father's voice was tight with a warning, "some things are better left buried. Your grandfather, he wouldn't want you digging into this." 17 men died, Dad. 17 families were lied to. If Grandpa was one of them? "Danny," his father's voice snapped, sharp and commanding. "Now drop this. Trust me, some stones are better left unturned." The line went dead. Danny stared at his phone, his father's chilling warning reverberating in his ears. But as his eyes fell upon his grandfather's name on the victim list, then to the uranium surveys in the evidence envelope, and finally to the photos he'd taken of the hastily sealed mine entrance, he knew with an undeniable certainty that he couldn't let this go. 17 men had died. Their families had been paid off, coerced into silence, and 5 decades later, someone was still meticulously guarding that truth. Danny Morrison was about to uncover precisely why. He spent the remainder of the afternoon attempting to locate the families of the other 16 miners listed in the incident report. Most of the surnames were familiar, names he'd seen on mailboxes, heard at town council meetings, families whose descendants still resided in and around Metuan. Yet with every call, he encountered the same impenetrable wall. The Henderson family?
Oh, they relocated years ago, right after old Bill passed, I believe. The Caldwells? Haven't seen any of them since I was a child. Heard they moved up north somewhere. Bobby Garrett's family? They used to live on Elm Street, but that house has been vacant for decades. By 5 p.m., Danny had made 23 phone calls and located precisely 0 living relatives of the Blackwater mine victims. In a town where family lineages stretched back generations, where everyone knew everyone else's business for half a century, somehow all the families connected to the worst mining disaster in local history had simply vanished. That wasn't normal. It wasn't even remotely possible.
Danny secured the files in his desk and drove home. But the questions gnawed at him. He lived in a modest house on the outskirts of town, a quiet place where he could think without interruption. After a dinner he barely tasted, he settled onto his back porch with a beer and his laptop, using the internet to scour for any trace of the missing families. What he uncovered was deeply unsettling. According to public records, 6 of the 17 families had sold their homes and moved out of state within 6 months of the mine incident. 3 more had relocated within West Virginia, but to counties far removed from Matewan. The remaining 8 families had simply evaporated from all records, leaving no forwarding addresses, no death certificates, no hint of what had become of them. Danny had investigated enough missing persons cases to understand that entire families didn't just vanish without leaving some form of paper trail. People had social security numbers, tax records, medical files. Someone, somewhere, always knew something. But the families of the Blackwater mine victims had been erased as thoroughly as if they had never existed. His phone rang, startling him, interrupting his frantic research. The caller ID displayed a number he didn't recognize. Sheriff Morrison? That's right. My name is Carl Hutchkins. I heard you've been asking questions about the old mine incident. Danny sat up straighter, his attention immediately piqued. Who informed you of that? Word travels swiftly in a small town, Sheriff. I was wondering if we could arrange a meeting to talk. There are certain things you should be aware of before you delve too deeply into this. What kind of things? The kind, Hutchkins' voice was grim, that led to a lot of good people getting hurt back in 1962. The kind that could still get people hurt today. Danny felt his pulse quicken. Are you threatening me, Mr. Hutchkins? No, sir. The voice on the other end was firm. I'm trying to warn you. There's a difference. Where do you propose we meet? You know the old diner on Route 119, about 10 miles north of town? I'll be there at 8. Come alone, and don't breathe a word of this to anyone. The line went dead before Danny could respond.
Danny stared at his phone, every instinct screaming that this was a terrible idea. Meeting unknown contacts in isolated locations was precisely the kind of scenario that got law enforcement officers killed. But Carl Hutchkins possessed information about the mine incident, and Danny needed answers more urgently than he needed safety. He holstered his service weapon, grabbed his truck keys, and headed out into the enveloping mountain darkness. The diner on Route 119 had been abandoned for years, but the parking lot lights, relics of a bygone era, still functioned, casting sickly yellow pools of illumination across the cracked asphalt. Danny arrived 15 minutes early and conducted a meticulous sweep of the area, searching for any signs of an ambush or backup vehicles. The place appeared utterly deserted, save for a single battered pickup truck parked near the diner's entrance. Precisely at 8 o'clock, a figure emerged from the deep shadows clinging to the side of the building. He was an elderly man, likely in his 70s, with a shock of white hair and a face deeply etched by decades of outdoor labor. He moved with a careful, measured gait, like someone whose joints had seen better days, yet his eyes were remarkably sharp and alert.
"Sheriff Morrison." "Mr. Hutchkins?" They shook hands, and Danny noted that despite the man's age, his grip was surprisingly strong. "Thank you for coming," Hutchkins said, his voice raspy. "I wasn't entirely certain you would. You indicated you had information about the mine incident." Hutchkins gestured towards a weather-beaten picnic table near the edge of the parking lot. "Let's sit. This is going to require some time." They settled across from each other, and Hutchkins produced a thermos from his jacket pocket. "Coffee? I'm good. Tell me about 1962. Hutchkins poured himself a cup, taking a long, contemplative sip before speaking. "I was 22 then. Worked at the mine for about 3 years, usually on the day shift. But on April 23rd, I called in sick." Danny's pulse quickened. "You were scheduled to work the day of the explosion?" "Should have been down there with the rest of them. James Morrison was my shift supervisor. A good man, a fair boss. If I hadn't been laid low with food poisoning that morning, I'd be dead too." "So, you believe the explosion genuinely occurred?"
Hutchkins let out a bitter, humorless laugh that grated in the quiet night. "Sheriff, there was no explosion." The words hung heavy in the cold air, a palpable, shocking declaration. Danny leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you mean?" "I mean, those 17 men didn't die in any methane blast. They were murdered, shot down in the tunnels like dogs, and then buried behind concrete and steel so no one could ever find their bodies." Danny's mouth went dry. How do you know this?" "Because," Hutchkins said, setting his coffee cup down and looking Danny directly in the eye, "I saw it happen. I may have called in sick, but I couldn't sleep that morning. Felt guilty about leaving my crew short-handed. So around noon, I drove out to the mine to see if they needed me for the afternoon shift." He paused, his hands trembling slightly as he picked up the thermos again. "When I arrived, I heard gunshots echoing from underground. Not 1 or 2 shots, mind you, a barrage of them, like a war was being fought down in those tunnels." "What did you do?" "I hid, tucked myself away behind one of the equipment sheds and waited. About 20 minutes later, men started emerging from the mine. Not miners, men in suits, carrying rifles. And behind them came more men in work clothes, but they weren't Cumberland Coal employees. I'd never seen any of them before." Danny pulled out his notebook, his pen poised. "How many men?" 8 or 10, perhaps more. They spent the next 2 hours bringing up equipment, files, boxes of things, loading it all into trucks that bore no company markings." "Did you recognize anyone?" Hutchkins nodded grimly. Harold Vance, the Cumberland Coal supervisor, and Sheriff Hawkins, both of them armed, both of them barking orders like they were running the whole operation. Ice formed in Danny's veins. The sheriff was involved?
Up to his neck. I watched him personally oversee the concrete trucks when they arrived to seal the mine entrance. Must have been 6 or 7 loads of concrete, far more than you'd ever need just to close a shaft. Why didn't you report what you witnessed? Hutchkins laughed again, but there was no mirth in it. To whom? The sheriff's department? Harold Vance practically owned half the county commissioners. And Sheriff, you must understand, this was 1962. The Cold War was raging. The government was running all sorts of black projects, and people who dared to ask too many questions had a way of simply vanishing. Danny studied the old man's face in the dim parking lot lights. But you're telling me now? Because I'm 73 years old, and I've carried this secret for 50 years. Because those 17 men had families who deserved to know the truth, and because... Hutchkins hesitated, his gaze fixed on some unseen point in the darkness. Because what? Danny urged. Because they're still out there, Sheriff. The people who ordered those killings. Perhaps not the identical individuals, but the same organizations, the same powerful interests. And if you continue to dig into this, they will come for you, the same way they came for anyone else who got too close to the truth. Danny leaned back, his mind reeling from the bombshell revelation. Mr. Hutchkins, if what you're telling me is true, we're talking about mass murder and a conspiracy involving local law enforcement and federal agencies. That, Hutchkins affirmed, his voice resolute, is precisely what I'm telling you. Why should I believe you? Hutchkins reached into his jacket and pulled out a small metallic object, setting it on the picnic table between them. It was a brass shell casing, tarnished with age, yet still clearly marked with caliber and manufacturer information. I picked this up outside the mine entrance that day. Figured someday someone might need proof that those men were shot, not killed in some explosion. Danny picked up the shell casing, turning it over in his hands. It was .30-06 caliber, military issue, the type of ammunition used in government-issued rifles.
There's something else, Hutchkins added, his voice dropping slightly. Something that might help you comprehend why they were willing to kill 17 men to keep it secret. He produced a folded piece of paper, yellowed and brittle with age. I managed to snatch this from one of the boxes they were loading into the trucks. A geological survey report. Danny carefully unfolded the paper, reading by the faint glow of his phone screen. The document was technical, filled with mining terminology he barely understood, but one section was circled in stark red ink. High-grade uranium ore deposits. Concentration 2.7% by weight. Estimated reserves 47,000 tons. Current market value $127 million. Danny let out a low whistle, the implications of the figure staggering. $127 million in 1962? Worth perhaps 10 times that in today's money, Hutchkins confirmed. And Sheriff, that was just the uranium. There were other minerals down there too, rare earth elements that were even more valuable for weapons research. Danny carefully unfolded the paper and tucked it into his jacket pocket, alongside the shell casing. Mr. Hutchkins, if you've possessed this evidence for 50 years, why didn't you ever— Because they killed anyone who tried, Hutchkins interrupted, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. 3 months after the mine incident, Deputy Collins, the one who wanted to investigate further, died in a car accident on a perfectly straight stretch of road he'd driven 1,000 times. 6 months later, a newspaper reporter from Charleston, who had begun asking questions about the mine, died of a sudden heart attack at age 31. A year after that, Harold Vance's own secretary completely disappeared after someone observed her photocopying company files. Danny felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool mountain air. They've been killing people to cover this up for 50 years, anyone who got too close to the truth. Sheriff, I'm telling you this because those 17 men deserve justice. But I'm also telling you because if you aren't careful, you are going to become number 18. Summoned by Hutchkins' dire warning, headlights appeared on Route 119, moving slowly toward the diner. Both men watched as a dark sedan glided into the parking lot, stopping about 50 yards away. Its engine idled, but the driver remained hidden inside. "Time for me to depart," Hutchkins announced, rising swiftly. "Sheriff, be exceptionally cautious about whom you trust. This conspiracy has roots in places you wouldn't expect." "Wait!" Danny called out, a desperate urgency in his voice. "How do I contact you if I require more information?" But Hutchkins was already moving towards his truck. "You don't. After tonight, Carl Hutchkins will vanish, just as those 17 families did. It is the only way to remain alive." He climbed into his truck and drove off, leaving Danny alone in the parking lot with the ominous sedan and a shell casing that unequivocally proved 17 men had been murdered for a uranium deposit now worth over $1 billion. The sedan's driver door opened, and a man in a crisp suit stepped out. Danny's hand, already at his service weapon, instinctively drew it as the figure advanced slowly across the asphalt. "Sheriff Morrison," the man's voice cut through the stillness, "I believe we need to speak." The suit-clad man was younger than Danny had anticipated, perhaps mid-40s, with a meticulously groomed appearance that screamed federal agent. He moved with the assured stride of someone perpetually in control, his hands visible yet poised for swift action. "Agent James Crawford, FBI. Care to have a conversation?" Danny kept his hand firmly on his weapon. "That depends," he replied, his gaze unwavering, "on the nature of this conversation you have in mind. The kind I elucidate why meddling in 50-year-old mining accidents might not serve your best interests, nor those of your community. Is that a veiled threat, Agent Crawford?" Crawford's lips curved into a smile that failed to reach his eyes. "Consider it practical counsel, Sheriff, from someone intimately familiar with the Blackwater situation." Danny scrutinized the man's face under the flickering parking lot lights. "How did you become aware of my presence here?"
We initiated monitoring of all communications pertinent to the Blackwater mine this morning, Crawford explained. Your calls to the state mining office triggered automated alerts in our system. Your system? Danny scoffed. And what system would that be? Crawford gestured towards the picnic table where Danny had just spoken with Hutchkins. Mind if we sit? This may require a few minutes. Against his better judgment, Danny nodded. They took seats opposite each other, and Crawford produced a manila folder from his jacket. "Sheriff Morrison, what I am about to disclose is classified information, shared with you purely as a professional courtesy. The Blackwater Mine incident of 1962 was an integral part of a federal operation directly linked to national security interest during the height of the Cold War." "What kind of operation?" Crawford opened the folder, revealing a document heavily redacted with stark black lines obscuring most of the text. "Uranium extraction for weapons development. The miners who perished were not victims of an industrial accident. They were casualties of a necessary operation to secure strategic materials vital to the defense of the United States." A surge of hot anger swelled in Danny's chest. "Are you asserting that the federal government murdered 17 miners?" "I am asserting, Sheriff," Crawford stated calmly, "that during the Cold War, difficult decisions were regrettably unavoidable to safeguard national security. The uranium deposits at Blackwater were paramount to our nuclear weapons program. When the miners inadvertently stumbled upon the true nature of their extraction, they became an unacceptable security risk." "So," Danny spat, the word laced with disgust, "you murdered them." Crawford's expression remained utterly impassive. The operation was executed by contractors operating under federal authority. The miners were extended relocation packages to other regions of the country, complete with new identities and significant financial compensation. Most accepted. Some did not. Danny pulled out his notebook. "Carl Hutchkins claims he witnessed men with rifles emerging from the mine. He claims he heard gunshots." Crawford closed the folder. "Carl Hutchkins is a 73-year-old man whose recollection of events from half a century ago may not be entirely accurate. There were no gunshots, Sheriff. There was no mass murder. There was a controlled relocation of civilian personnel who had access to classified information." "Then why," Danny challenged, his voice rising, "was my grandfather listed as dead in the county incident report?" "Because James Morrison refused relocation. He insisted on remaining in Matewan, continuing his work at the mine. thereby potentially jeopardizing the entire operation. He was afforded multiple opportunities to accept the relocation package. Crawford leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Your grandfather was a patriot, Sheriff, but he was also profoundly stubborn. When he threatened to disclose information regarding the uranium extraction, difficult decisions had to be made. A physical blow could not have stunned Danny more. You killed my grandfather because he wouldn't keep quiet about a government mining operation?
Your grandfather, Crawford corrected, his voice resonating with a disturbing conviction, died in service to his country, no differently than soldiers who fall in classified missions overseas. The distinction is, we could not bestow upon him a medal or a military funeral without compromising national security. Danny shot to his feet abruptly. You murdered 17 miners and orchestrated a cover-up. Crawford remained seated, his voice unnervingly calm. Sheriff, I appreciate that this is challenging information to process. However, you must comprehend the larger context. The uranium extracted from Blackwater Mine was instrumental in forging nuclear weapons that ultimately helped conclude the Cold War and preserved American lives for decades. By executing American citizens? Danny retorted, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. By making difficult choices in difficult times, Crawford concluded, rising to his feet and closing his folder with a decisive snap. The very same arduous choices that are still being made today, all in the name of national security.
A cold dread, more profound than the mountain air, settled over Danny. Is that why you're here, Agent Crawford? He pressed, his voice barely a whisper. To ensure I make the right choice? Crawford's gaze was unyielding. I'm here to offer you the same opportunity your grandfather was given, Sheriff. Walk away from this investigation and your family remains safe. Your career continues uninterrupted. Life goes on as normal. And if I don't walk away? Danny challenged, his hand instinctively resting on his holstered weapon. Crawford's lips curved into another smile, but this one held a predatory edge that made Danny's blood run cold. Sheriff, you're investigating the deaths of 17 men who supposedly perished 50 years ago. If something were to happen to you during that investigation, an accident at an abandoned mine site, perhaps, a structural collapse in an old tunnel, it would be a tragic, yet entirely understandable occupational hazard. Danny's fingers tightened on his service weapon. Now that definitely sounds like a threat, Agent Crawford. It's a reality check, Sheriff, Crawford countered, his voice smooth as polished stone. The people who ordered the Blackwater operation are still alive, still in positions of power, still making decisions about national security. They've spent 50 years protecting this secret, and they are not going to let a small-town sheriff expose it now.
Crawford turned to walk back towards his sedan, then paused, looking over his shoulder. You have 24 hours to decide, Sheriff. After that, the offer expires. What offer? Danny demanded, his mind racing. The offer to walk away and live a long, quiet life. Crawford got into his car, rolling down the window just enough for his voice to carry. Oh, and Sheriff, Carl Hutchkins won't be available for any more conversations. He's decided to take an extended vacation out of state. Permanently. The sedan pulled away, its taillights vanishing into the darkness, leaving Danny alone in the desolate parking lot. In his pocket, the brass shell casing felt heavy, a tangible link to a truth so monstrous it defied belief. 17 men, murdered for a uranium deposit now worth over $1 billion in today's money. The terrible understanding dawned on him. He was now a target in a conspiracy that had been killing people for 5 decades. He got into his truck and drove home, his mind a maelstrom of conflicting thoughts. Crawford's sanitized tale of voluntary relocation clashed violently with Hutchins's terrified account of gunshots and bodies. But Crawford's veiled threats were chillingly real, and the implication that Hutchins had been silenced or forced to disappear was terrifying. Back at his house, Danny sat at his kitchen table, spreading out every piece of information he had.
The county incident report, with his grandfather's name circled, the geological surveys boldly displaying uranium deposits worth billions, the shell casing Hutchins had given him, and the photos he'd taken of the hastily sealed mine entrance. The evidence overwhelmingly pointed to mass murder and a federal cover-up. Yet Crawford's sinister warning echoed in his ears. Pursuing the truth could get Danny killed, just as it had gotten others killed over the past 50 years. Danny's phone rang, startling him, the caller ID displaying his father's number. "Danny, are you all right?" His father's voice, laced with worry, asked immediately. "I'm fine, Dad. Why?" "Because I just had a visit from 2 men in suits who said you were investigating dangerous criminal activity related to the old mine. They wanted to know if you'd said anything to me about what you found." Danny felt his blood run cold. "What did you tell them?" "I told them you hadn't shared any details with me, which is true. But Danny, these men, they weren't local law enforcement. They knew things about our family, about your grandfather, that nobody should know." "What kind of things?" "They knew about the heart attack story," his father continued, his voice hushed. "They knew we'd never told you the truth about how your grandfather died. And son, they knew your mother's maiden name, where she went to school, where she worked before she married me. They knew details about our lives that felt like threats."
Danny closed his eyes. The conspiracy wasn't just coming for him. They were putting pressure on his family to make sure he backed down. "Dad, I need you and Mom to pack a bag and go visit Aunt Sarah in Charleston for a few days, right now." "Danny, what have you gotten yourself into? I found out what really happened to Grandpa, and now the people who killed him are threatening anyone who might help me expose the truth." His father was quiet for a long moment. "Son, there are some things that are better left buried. Your grandfather tried to do the right thing 50 years ago. It got him killed. Don't make the same mistake." "Maybe it's time someone finished what Grandpa started," Danny retorted, his resolve hardening. "Danny, please think about your family," his father pleaded. "Think about the people in this town who depend on you. Is digging up 50-year-old secrets worth risking all of that?" Danny looked at the evidence spread across his kitchen table, at his grandfather's name on the victim list, at the shell casing that proved 17 men had been murdered for uranium deposits. "Yeah, Dad, I think it is."
After hanging up, Danny made 2 critical decisions. First, he was going to find a way to get into the sealed Blackwater mine and document what was truly down there. Second, he was going to find out if any of the 17 miners had actually survived the 1962 incident and been forced into hiding, just as Carl Hutchins had claimed. Agent Crawford had made one crucial mistake during their conversation. He'd mentioned that some of the miners had accepted relocation packages and moved to other parts of the country with new identities. If that was true, then some of the Blackwater victims might still be alive. And if Danny could find them, he might be able to get the testimony he needed to expose 50 years of murder and cover-ups. But first, He had to make sure his parents got out of town before the federal agents decided they were liabilities that needed to be eliminated. Danny grabbed his keys and headed back out into the mountain darkness. He had less than 24 hours to decide whether to walk away or fight. And he'd already made his choice. Danny's first stop was his parents' house, a small brick ranch on the outskirts of town where he'd grown up. The porch light was on, and through the front window he could see his father sitting in his recliner, staring at the television without truly watching it. His mother answered the door in her bathrobe, her face tight with worry. "Danny, what's going on? Your father won't tell me anything about those men who came by." "Mom, I need you and Dad to pack a bag and drive to Charleston tonight. Stay with Aunt Sarah for a few days." "Why? What's happening?" Danny's father appeared behind her, his expression grim. "Because our son has decided to poke a hornet's nest that's been quiet for 50 years. James Morrison was my grandfather," Danny stated firmly. "I have a right to know how he really died." His father stepped onto the porch and closed the door behind him. "Danny, let me tell you something about your grandfather that I never wanted you to know. He was a good man, but he was also stubborn as a mule. When he got an idea in his head about right and wrong, nothing could change his mind." "That sounds like something to be proud of."
"It is," his father conceded, "but it's also what got him killed." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Your grandfather found something in that mine that he wasn't supposed to see. Government men came and told him to keep quiet, offered him money to relocate the family. He refused, said he had a responsibility to his community, to the other miners. So they murdered him. They made him disappear, along with anyone else who wouldn't take their money and keep their mouth shut." His father gripped Danny's shoulder. "Son, I was 10 years old when it happened. I watched my mother cry herself to sleep every night for 2 years after we were told he died in an explosion. I watched our neighbors pack up and leave town one by one until there was nobody left who remembered what really happened." Danny felt something cold settle deep at his chest. How many people knew the truth? Everybody knew something was wrong. You don't lose 17 men in an explosion and have it wrapped up in 3 weeks unless powerful people want it wrapped up. But nobody talked about it because the families who asked too many questions ended up like the Hendersons. What happened to the Hendersons? His father was quiet for a long moment. Billy Henderson's widow refused to sign the settlement papers, said she wanted a real investigation into how her husband died. 3 months later, their house burned down in the middle of the night. Martha Henderson and her 2 kids died in the fire. Official cause was electrical problems, but everybody knew better. Danny felt sick. They killed a woman and her children? They killed anyone who threatened to expose the truth, and now you're threatening to do the same thing. His father looked toward the street where a sedan with tinted windows was parked under a streetlight. "They're watching us right now. Danny, those men who came by earlier, they're still here." Danny followed his father's gaze and saw the car. It hadn't been there when he arrived. "All the more reason for you to get out of town tonight," Danny said. "Drive to Charleston. Stay with Aunt Sarah. Don't tell anyone where you're going."
His mother appeared in the doorway again. "Danny, why can't you just let sleeping dogs lie? Your grandfather's been gone 50 years. Digging this up won't bring him back. But it might bring justice for 17 families who were lied to and threatened into silence. And it might get you killed," his father said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Is that what you want? Is that what your grandfather would want?" Danny thought about the shell casing in his pocket, about Carl Hutchkin's terrified face in the diner parking lot, about Agent Crawford's casual threats.
His father was right. Pursuing this investigation could get him killed. But it could also expose a conspiracy that had been murdering innocent people for half a century. "I'll be careful," Danny said, "but I can't walk away from this." His father nodded slowly. "I knew you'd say that. You're just like him, you know. Same stubborn streak, same sense of right and wrong." He sighed. "We'll pack a bag and leave tonight. But Danny, if something happens to you, if you disappear like your grandfather did, I want you to know that we understand why you did it." Danny hugged both his parents, a heavy knot forming in his stomach, knowing it might be the last time he saw them. As he walked back to his truck, he noticed the sedan's engine start up. They were going to follow him, which meant his parents would be safe once he led the surveillance away from their house. Danny drove toward the center of town, taking a circuitous route that would give his parents time to pack and leave. The sedan stayed behind him, maintaining a professional distance, but making no effort to hide their presence. They wanted him to know he was being watched.
At the sheriff's office, Danny parked under the lights and walked inside. Knowing the surveillance team would have to decide whether to follow him into a law enforcement building or wait outside. They chose to wait. Danny went to his desk and opened the locked drawer where he'd stored the Blackwater mine files. Everything was still there, but something felt different. The papers were stacked slightly differently than he'd left them, and there was a faint smell of cologne in the air that hadn't been there before. Someone had been through his desk. Danny gathered up the files and his laptop, then walked to the back exit of the building. His patrol car was parked in the rear lot, away from the street where the surveillance team was waiting. If he was lucky, he could get a few hours' head start before they realized he'd slipped away. But first, he needed to make a stop that might get him the breakthrough he needed. 20 minutes later, Danny pulled up in front of a small house on the edge of Matwan's industrial district. The address had taken him an hour of searching through property records, but he'd finally found what he was looking for: the current address of Ruth Morrison, his grandfather's sister.
Aunt Ruth was 86 years old and lived alone in a house filled with 50 years of accumulated memories. She answered the door in a housecoat, her white hair in curlers, squinting at him through thick glasses. "Danny, what are you doing here at this hour?" "Aunt Ruth, I need to ask you about Grandpa James." Her expression changed immediately, weariness replacing confusion. "What about him?" "I found the real file about how he died. I know about the mine, about the uranium, about what really happened to those 17 men." Ruth Morrison looked past Danny toward the street, checking for surveillance, then pulled him inside and locked the door behind him. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice low. "They're probably watching." "Who's watching?" "The same people who've been watching our family for 50 years. The same people who made sure nobody ever talked about what really happened at Blackwater." Ruth led him to the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee, her hands shaking slightly as she worked. "Danny, there are things about your grandfather that your father doesn't know. Things I promised never to tell anyone." "What kind of things?" Ruth sat down across from him at the kitchen table. "Your grandfather didn't just refuse to take their money and keep quiet. He was documenting everything that happened at that mine. He had proof of the uranium extraction, proof of the government involvement, proof of the cover-up." Danny leaned forward, his heart pounding. "What happened to the proof?" "He hid it somewhere safe, somewhere he thought nobody would ever find it." Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "The night before he died, he came here and gave me a key. Said if anything happened to him, I should give it to someone who could use it to get justice for the other families." She stood up and walked to an old grandfather clock in the corner of the kitchen. Behind the pendulum
Taped to the back panel was a small brass key.
"I've been carrying this secret for 50 years," Ruth murmured, her voice thick with a lifetime of unspoken burdens, as she pressed the small brass key into Danny's palm. "Waitin' for someone in the family to be brave enough to finish what James started." Danny's fingers closed around the key. It felt ancient, heavy with history and secrets. He turned it over, the tarnished metal cool against his skin, and saw numbers etched into its surface. 247. "What does it open?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. A faint, almost wistful smile touched Ruth's lips, the first he'd seen since his arrival. "Your grandfather," she began, her gaze distant, lost in memories, "rented a safety deposit box at the First National Bank in Logan County, under a false name, of course." She met Danny's eyes, a fierce protective glint in her own. "Everything he documented about Blackwater, it's all in that box." Danny's pulse quickened, a surge of adrenaline washing over him. "What name did he use?" "Patrick Morrison," Ruth replied, squeezing his hand. "His middle name and our maiden name." Her grip tightened, her expression solemn. "Danny, if what's in that box is as damaging as your grandfather believed, the people who killed him won't hesitate to kill you, too." "I know," Danny conceded, the words heavy with the gravity of the truth. "But, Aunt Ruth, if I don't do this, they'll keep killing people to protect their secret. How many more Carl Hutchkins are going to disappear? How many more families are going to be threatened into silence?" Ruth nodded slowly, a profound understanding passing between them. "Your grandfather would be proud of you," she said, her voice laced with both pride and fear, "and terrified for you." She moved back to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to peer out. "There's a car across the street that wasn't there when you arrived." Danny joined her, his eyes scanning the darkened street. Sure enough, a different sedan sat under a flickering streetlight, its engine humming almost imperceptibly. "They found me," he stated, the realization chilling him. "Which means they'll be watching the bank tomorrow." "Then you'll have to be smarter than they are," Ruth countered, a steely resolve in her voice. "The same way your grandfather was smarter than them for 50 years. Danny leaned down and kissed his aunt's cheek, a silent promise in the gesture, then headed for the back door. "If anyone asks," he said, opening the door into the cool night air, "I was never here." "Danny!" Ruth called softly after him, her voice filled with urgency. "Be careful. And remember, your grandfather didn't die for nothing if you can finally get justice for those 17 families." Danny slipped out the back door and moved silently through Ruth's neighbor's yard, making his way to where he'd wisely parked his patrol car 3 blocks away. The surveillance team, he knew, would be fixated on the front of Ruth's house, waiting for him to re-emerge the way he'd entered. As he drove toward Logan County and the First National Bank, the weight of the small brass key in his pocket felt immense. He was now carrying the key to evidence that could expose a 50-year government conspiracy involving mass murder and corporate cover-ups. But he was also being hunted by federal agents who had been killing witnesses for half a century. The race was on to see who would get to James Morrison's safety deposit box first, Danny or the shadowy figures who had murdered his grandfather to keep him from ever opening it. The First National Bank in Logan County was scheduled to open at 9 a.m., but Danny arrived at 7:30, using the pre-dawn quiet to meticulously study the building and plan his approach. The surveillance sedan had followed him part way, but had disappeared once he crossed county lines. This could mean they either had other assets already in place, or they were confident they knew his destination. Danny parked 2 blocks away and walked through the early morning mist that clung to the mountains around Logan.
feeling the damp chill seep into his bones. The bank was a small brick building from the 1960s, unassuming and solid. The kind of place where safety deposit boxes were likely accessed through a basement vault that probably hadn't been updated since his grandfather's time. At 8:45, Danny watched from across the street as two men in impeccably tailored suits entered the bank. They weren't customers. Their rigid posture, the way their eyes meticulously scanned the interior, screamed federal agents. Crawford's people had beaten him there. Suddenly, Danny's radio crackled to life, startling him. "Sheriff Morrison, this is dispatch. We've got a situation at the Blackwire mine site. Someone called in suspicious activity. Possible break-in." Danny keyed the mic, his mind racing. What kind of suspicious activity? Callers said they saw lights moving around inside the sealed entrance. Might be kids, but the property owner wants it checked out. Danny felt his stomach drop. The timing was far too convenient to be a coincidence. "I'm in Logan County on official business. Send Deputy Williams to check it out." "Williams is responding to a domestic disturbance, Sheriff. You want me to call the state police?" "Negative," Danny replied, his voice firm. "I'll handle it when I get back." But he knew the call was a feint, a desperate attempt by Crawford's people to draw him away from the bank, back to the mine, where they could isolate him and permanently eliminate the problem. This meant whatever was hidden in his grandfather's safety deposit box was dangerous enough to kill for.
At exactly 9 a.m., Danny walked into the First National Bank. The two federal agents were standing near the customer service desk, showing badges to the visibly nervous bank manager. Danny couldn't discern their exact conversation, but he saw the manager nodding anxiously and pointing toward the basement stairs. Danny approached the teller window, the brass key clutched in his hand. "I need to access a safety deposit box, please." The young teller looked past Danny toward the federal agents, uncertainty clouding her face. Sir, I think you need to speak with Mr. Patterson, our manager. He's dealing with some kind of situation right now regarding the safety deposit boxes." "What kind of situation?" Danny pressed, a cold dread beginning to spread through him. "I'm not sure. Those men said something about a federal investigation into fraudulent accounts." Ice formed in Danny's veins. Crawford's people were trying to seize his grandfather's box before he could access it. In a few minutes, 50 years of critical evidence would disappear into federal custody and never be seen again. Danny pulled out his sheriff's badge, holding it up for the teller to see. "This is related to an ongoing criminal investigation in Mingo County. I need immediate access to Box 247 under the name Patrick Morrison." The teller hesitated, her gaze flickering between Danny's official badge and the federal agents across the lobby. "Let me get Mr. Patterson." "There's no time for that," Danny said, raising his voice, making sure it carried clearly across the quiet bank lobby, loud enough for the federal agents to hear. "I have a valid court order requiring immediate access to that box."
It was a blatant lie, but it had the desired effect. Both agents turned abruptly toward the teller window, and Danny saw a flicker of recognition and something darker flash across their faces. "Sheriff Morrison," one of them called out, walking toward him with a casual but deliberate hand resting on his jacket, right where a shoulder holster would be. "Agent Crawford sent us to assist with your investigation." "Funny," Danny countered, a grim smile touching his lips. "Crawford told me to stay away from this investigation." "Plans change," the agent said, his voice smooth, devoid of emotion. "We're here to make sure you get the evidence you need safely." Danny studied the man's face, his posture, everything about him screaming threat, not assistance. "In that case," Danny said, his voice even, "you won't mind if I access the box first and review the contents before sharing them with federal authorities." "Actually, we do mind."
National security protocols require federal oversight of any evidence related to the Blackwater incident. The bank manager, Mr. Patterson, a thin man in his 50s who clearly wished he were anywhere else, approached nervously. "Gentlemen, perhaps we could resolve this upstairs in my office?" "No," Danny said firmly, meeting Patterson's anxious gaze. "I'm accessing that box now, as part of an active homicide investigation." He handed the key to the trembling teller. "Box 247, Patrick Morrison. I'll need a witness present during the opening." The federal agent stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, warning tone. "Sheriff, I don't think you understand the situation here. That box contains classified materials that were illegally obtained by a civilian contractor 50 years ago. We're here to secure those materials for national security purposes." "What I understand," Danny said loudly, ensuring every customer in the bank heard him, "is that you're trying to suppress evidence in a mass murder case, and you're doing it in front of witnesses."
The bank lobby had fallen into a terrified silence. Other customers stared, wide-eyed, and Danny saw the teller's hand move instinctively to what was probably a panic button under her counter. The federal agent's partner moved to Danny's left side, subtly positioning himself to block any potential escape route. "Sheriff Morrison," the first agent said, his voice now colder, "I think you should come with us. We need to discuss the situation privately." Danny's hand moved to his service weapon, his grip tightening. "The only place I'm going is downstairs to open that safety deposit box. And if you try to stop me, I'll arrest you for interfering with a criminal investigation." "On what authority?" the agent sneered. "On the authority of the 17 families who were lied to about how their loved ones died," Danny retorted, his voice ringing with conviction. "On the authority of a 50-year cover-up that's still claiming victims." Danny looked directly at the bank manager, his eyes piercing. "Mr. Patterson, are you going to let federal agents intimidate you into violating your customers' legal rights?" Patterson looked between Danny and the agents, clearly terrified, his face ashen. I think I need to call our legal department." "No time for that," the first federal agent said, pulling out his phone and making a quick call. "It's done. Secure the building." Danny heard the front door of the bank lock electronically. Through the windows he could see more agents taking up positions outside. "Sheriff Morrison," the agent said, his voice now devoid of any pretense of courtesy, "we are under federal detention for interfering with a national security operation. You'll be released once we've secured the classified materials." "You have no legal authority to detain me," Danny stated, his jaw set. "We have all the authority we need." That's when Danny made a decision that would either save his life or end it. He drew his service weapon and pointed it squarely at the federal agent. "Everyone on the ground now," he shouted, his voice echoing through the stunned bank. "This is Sheriff Morrison, and I'm placing these men under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder."
The bank erupted in chaos. Customers screamed and dropped to the floor, seeking cover. The teller hit the panic button, a shrill alarm piercing the air. The federal agents, startled but professional, drew their own weapons, aiming at Danny. "You're making a big mistake, Sheriff," one of the agents warned, his gun trained on Danny's chest. "The mistake was made 50 years ago," Danny replied, his voice firm, "when you murdered my grandfather and 16 other innocent men. Now we're going to find out what they died trying to protect." Danny backed slowly toward the basement stairs, keeping his weapon aimed at the agents. "Mr. Patterson," he commanded, his voice unwavering, "you're coming with me. We're going to open that box, and you're going to witness everything we find." "Sheriff, I can't," Patterson stammered, fear gripping him. "You can and you will,"
Danny cut him off, "because in about 5 minutes, this story is going to be all over the news, and you're going to want to be on the right side of history." Danny reached the basement stairs and started backing down them, Patterson reluctantly stumbling behind him. From above, he could hear the federal agents coordinating on their radios, their voices clipped and urgent, probably calling for backup and tactical support. In the cold, sterile light of the basement vault, surrounded by hundreds of identical safety deposit boxes, Danny finally understood why his grandfather had been willing to die rather than let this secret stay buried. Because Box 247 was about to prove that the Blackwater mine conspiracy wasn't just about uranium extraction and Cold War paranoia. It was about something much bigger, much more valuable, and much more dangerous than anyone had imagined.
Danny inserted the key into box 247 and turned it. The lock clicked open with a definitive sound, and 50 years of secrets were about to see daylight for the first time since James Morrison had sealed them away. The safety deposit box was larger than Danny had expected and remarkably heavy. Patterson, still trembling, helped him carry it to the examination table in the center of the vault. Both men's hands shook slightly as they set it down. From upstairs, Danny could hear the federal agents coordinating their response, their voices echoing down the stairwell. They were probably sealing the building and calling for tactical backup, but Danny estimated he had maybe 10 minutes before they decided to storm the basement vault. "Mr. Patterson," Danny said, his voice steady despite the tension, "I need you to document everything we find in this box. Take photos with your phone, make notes, whatever you can do. If something happens to me, this evidence needs to get to the media." Patterson nodded nervously, his face pale, and pulled out his phone. Danny lifted the lid of the safety deposit box and felt his breath catch in his throat. The box was filled with documents, yellowed photographs, and what appeared to be geological samples carefully wrapped in cloth bags. But on top of everything was a letter, addressed to whoever finds this, written in his grandfather's unmistakable hand. Danny unfolded the letter carefully, the ancient paper crinkling softly, and began to read aloud, his voice low but clear in the quiet vault. "If you're reading this, it means I'm dead, and the people responsible for the Blackwater mine murders are still covering up their crimes. My name is James Patrick Morrison, and I was the lead foreman at Blackwater Mine when 17 good men were killed on April 23, 1962. He paused, the weight of his grandfather's words, of his sacrifice, pressing down on him. "What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but every word is documented in this box. The Blackwater Mine wasn't just extracting uranium for nuclear weapons. We found something else down there, something that the government and private contractors have been killing people to hide for 50 years. We found rare earth elements in concentrations that shouldn't exist in nature, elements that are essential for advanced electronics, satellite communications, and weapon systems that wouldn't even be invented for decades. Someone knew those elements were there before we did." Danny looked up at Patterson, who was recording everything with his phone, his hand surprisingly steady. "Keep going," Patterson whispered, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe.
Danny continued reading, his voice regaining strength with each word, transforming from a personal quest into a public revelation. On April 20th, 1962, 3 days before the murders, government scientists arrived at the mine with equipment I'd never seen before. They took core samples from the deepest tunnels and confirmed what they already suspected. The Blackwater mine contained enough rare earth elements to supply the entire U.S. military for decades. But here's what they didn't expect. We miners had been talking to each other about the strange rocks we'd been finding. Some of us had even taken samples home to show our families. A few had even taken samples to geology professors at the state university. When the government men realized we'd been collecting samples, they panicked. They couldn't let civilian scientists analyze elements that were supposedly secret for national security reasons, so they decided to eliminate all witnesses. Danny felt a wave of nausea, a profound sickness in his gut as he continued reading his grandfather's account of calculated, cold-blooded murder. Offered us relocation packages first, new identities, government jobs in other states, enough money to set up our families anywhere we wanted. Most of the men were tempted. It was more money than any of us had ever seen. But I knew something was wrong. If the government was willing to pay 17 families to disappear, whatever was in that mine was worth far more than they were telling us. So I started documenting everything. I hid core samples, photographed the mining equipment, copied geological surveys, and recorded conversations with the government scientists. Everything is in this box, along with proof that the methane explosion was actually a coordinated execution carried out by federal contractors. Danny's hands were shaking visibly as he reached the final, heart-wrenching paragraph. If you're my family reading this, know that I love you and I'm sorry for the pain my death will cause. But these 17 men have families too, and they deserve to know the truth. The Blackwater mine contains enough rare earth elements to be worth over $10 billion in today's money. 17 good men died, so that money could be stolen by people who were supposed to protect American citizens, not murder them. Use this evidence to get justice. Use it to expose the conspiracy, and use it to make sure no other families have to suffer what ours has suffered. James Patrick Morrison, April 22, 1962.
Danny gently placed the letter back in the box and started going through the other contents. There were dozens of photographs, stark black and white images of the mining operation, geological surveys meticulously documenting the rare earth deposits, and even old audio recordings on magnetic tape reels. But what truly made Danny's blood run cold were the execution orders, typed on official government letterhead, classified at the highest levels. These were direct orders to eliminate civilian assets with knowledge of Project Blackwater and secure all physical evidence of rare earth extraction operations. The orders were signed by officials whose names Danny recognized from history books, people who had gone on to hold high positions in government and private industry for decades after the Blackwater murders. "Jesus Christ," Patterson whispered, looking over Danny's shoulder, his phone still recording, though futilely. "This goes all the way to the top."
Danny picked up one of the small cloth bags containing geological samples. Even 50 years later, he could discern the unusual coloration and crystalline structure that marked these as something far different from ordinary coal mining debris. His phone buzzed suddenly with a text message from an unknown number. "You have 2 minutes to surrender the contents of that box or we're coming down." Danny looked at Patterson, a desperate plan forming in his mind. "Can you upload those photos to a cloud storage account right now? All of them." "Already doing it," Patterson said, his fingers flying across his phone screen, rapidly sending everything to multiple email accounts and social media platforms. Good man. Danny quickly gathered the most damaging documents: the execution orders, his grandfather's letter, and the geological surveys showing the true astronomical value of the rare earth deposits. He stuffed them inside his jacket just as heavy footsteps started echoing down the basement stairs. "Sheriff Morrison," Agent Crawford's voice boomed through the vault, chillingly calm. "This is your final warning. Surrender the classified materials and come upstairs peacefully." "Go to hell, Crawford," Danny shouted back, his own voice hoarse with defiance. "This evidence is going public, whether you kill me or not."
Actually, it's not. Crawford appeared at the bottom of the stairs, flanked by 4 tactical agents, all armed with automatic weapons, their faces grim.
Mr. Patterson has just discovered that his phone has no signal down here. Very convenient design feature for a bank vault, wouldn't you say?" Crawford smirked, a cruel glint in his eyes. "And his photos, they uploaded to servers that we control." Patterson looked at his phone in horror, his face draining of all color. "The upload failed," he whispered, utterly defeated. "None of it went through." Crawford's smirk widened. "Sheriff Morrison, you're going to hand over every document, every photograph, and every sample in that box. Then you're going to forget this investigation ever happened." "And if I refuse?" Danny challenged, his hand moving subtly toward his holstered weapon. "Then you'll join your grandfather in an unmarked grave, and the official record will show that Sheriff Danny Morrison died in a tragic mining accident while investigating reports of trespassers at the abandoned Blackwater mine."
Danny looked around the vault, calculating his options. 4 heavily armed federal agents, no backup, no way to communicate with the outside world, and evidence that could expose a 50-year conspiracy worth billions of dollars. But his grandfather had faced a similar choice 50 years ago, and James Morrison had chosen to hide the evidence rather than let it be destroyed. Danny was about to make the same choice. "Crawford," he said, his voice controlled, "before you kill me, answer one question. How many people have you murdered to protect this secret?" "Does it matter?" Crawford shrugged, feigning indifference. "National security requires difficult decisions. It matters to the families, it matters to the victims, and it's going to matter to the media when this story breaks." Crawford laughed, a humorless, guttural sound. "What media? You're alone down here, Sheriff. No witnesses, no backup, no evidence that's going to survive the next 5 minutes." That's when Danny heard something that changed everything. Sirens. Multiple vehicles getting closer, their wails growing louder with each passing second. Crawford's confidence flickered, a momentary tremor in his carefully constructed composure. "What did you do?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing.
Danny smiled, a genuine defiant grin. "I called the state police before I came in, told them I was investigating federal agents who were interfering with a homicide investigation, gave them the address, and told them if they didn't hear from me in 30 minutes, they should assume I was in federal custody." It was a bold bluff, but Crawford didn't know that. The sirens were getting louder, and Danny could see doubt, a nascent fear, creeping into the federal agents' faces. "You're bluffing," Crawford insisted, though his voice lacked its previous certainty. "Maybe," Danny countered, his gaze unwavering. "But are you willing to bet $10 billion worth of rare earth elements on it?" That's when the shooting started upstairs. The gunfire upstairs was brief but intense. Automatic weapons, handguns, and what sounded like shotgun blasts echoed through the bank's main floor. Then, a sudden, terrifying silence. Crawford pressed his radio earpiece, his face grim with anticipation. "Report," he barked. Static. Then a voice, calm and detached. "Building secure. Local law enforcement neutralized. No media presence."
Danny felt his stomach drop, a sickening lurch. The sirens hadn't been the state police coming to rescue him. They'd been more federal agents arriving to contain the situation. "Disappointed, Sheriff?" Crawford asked, a smug, chilling smile returning to his face. "Did you really think we'd operate for 50 years without learning how to handle local law enforcement interference?" Danny's mind raced, a terrible understanding dawning on him. If Crawford's people had neutralized local law enforcement, that meant other cops were dead or wounded,
because of his investigation. The weight of that responsibility hit him like a physical blow, heavy and suffocating. "How many?" Danny asked quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "How many what?" Crawford asked, still savoring his victory. "How many cops did you kill?" Crawford shrugged, a dismissive gesture that made Danny's blood run cold. Does it matter? They were casualties in a national security operation, just like you're about to be. Danny looked at Patterson, who had gone utterly pale and was backing toward the far wall of the vault. The bank manager clearly understood that he was about to become another casualty in a conspiracy that had been claiming victims for half a century. "Mr. Patterson," Danny said, his voice filled with genuine regret, "I'm sorry you got involved in this." "So am I," Crawford said, his voice flat. "But witnesses are liabilities, and we don't leave liabilities behind."
That's when Danny noticed something Crawford hadn't seen. Patterson's phone, which had been recording, was still running. The upload might have failed, but the local recording was still intact, capturing everything Crawford had just said about killing law enforcement officers. Danny needed to buy time and get more incriminating evidence on that recording. "Crawford," Danny said, feigning a sudden, morbid curiosity, "before you kill us, satisfy my curiosity about something. How long has this operation been running? Just since 1962? Crawford checked his watch impatiently, a hint of disdain in his expression. "Sheriff, we don't have time for humor at Dead Man." "The rare earth elements in Blackwater," Danny pressed, ignoring the jibe. "When did the government first know they were there?" Crawford smiled, apparently enjoying the opportunity to explain his organization's chilling success, a hubris that Danny hoped to exploit. "We've known about unusual mineral deposits in Appalachia since the 1940s. What we didn't know was exactly how valuable they would become for electronics and weapons systems." "So you've been murdering miners for 80 years?" Danny stated, letting the horrifying truth hang in the air. "We've been protecting strategic resources for 80 years, Crawford corrected, his voice devoid of any moral conflict. "The Blackwater incident was just one operation in a much larger program."
Danny felt sick, his stomach churning with disgust and a profound sense of the scale of the evil he was confronting. "How many other mines?" "Dozens, across multiple states," Crawford answered, seemingly proud of the scope. "Whenever civilian miners discovered resources that were classified for national security purposes, we implemented containment protocols." "Containment protocols?" Danny's voice was laced with bitter irony. "Is that what you call mass murder?" Crawford's expression hardened, his patience wearing thin. "I call it protecting American interests against foreign adversaries who would use those resources against us." Danny looked around the vault, his eyes settling on the cloth bags containing his grandfather's geological samples. If Crawford was telling the truth about dozens of other operations, then the Blackwater conspiracy was just the tip of a massive, horrifying iceberg. The families who disappeared? Danny remembered, the unsettling records of vanishings he'd found. The ones who took relocation packages. What really happened to them? Some of them accepted new identities and government jobs as promised, Crawford explained, a faint glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. They're living comfortable lives under federal protection. And the ones who didn't accept? Crawford's silence was answer enough, a chilling confirmation of the dark fate that had befallen those who resisted. Suddenly, Danny's radio crackled unexpectedly, a jolt of hope in the otherwise suffocating atmosphere. "Sheriff Morrison, this is Deputy Williams. I'm at the Blackwater mine site investigating reports of suspicious activity. I found something you need to see immediately."
Crawford instinctively grabbed for Danny's radio, but Danny was faster.
He keyed the mic before Crawford could stop him. "Williams, whatever you found, document it and get it to the state police immediately. Federal agents are trying to cover up a mass murder from 1962. "Sheriff, what are you talking about?" Williams' voice was confused, strained. "I'm looking at fresh excavation equipment here. Someone's been digging into the sealed mine entrance." Crawford went white, his smug expression replaced by genuine alarm. "That's impossible. The site is under surveillance." But Danny understood what was happening. "Williams, how fresh is the excavation?" "Looks like it happened within the last few hours. Sheriff, there's something else. I found an elderly man hiding in the woods near the mine. Says his name is Carl Hutchkins and he needs to talk to you immediately." Crawford's tactical team exchanged frantic glances. Their surveillance hadn't been as complete as they'd thought. Carl Hutchkins was alive. "Williams," Danny said quickly, before Crawford could recover and intervene, "Hutchkins is a witness to the 1962 murders. He has evidence. Get him to safety and contact the FBI immediately." "Sheriff, there's no need for—" Crawford started to say, lunging again for the radio. "Not your FBI," Danny interrupted, still keying the mic, his voice urgent. "Contact the FBI field office in Charleston and tell them federal agents are impersonating law enforcement officers in Logan County. Tell them Sheriff Morrison is being held against his will by people claiming to be Agent Crawford's team." Crawford seized the radio and smashed it violently against the concrete wall, shattering it into pieces. "That was a mistake, Sheriff," he snarled, his face contorted with fury. "Now we'll have to kill your deputy, too."
But the damage was done. Williams had heard everything. And if Carl Hutchkins was really alive and at the mine site, that meant the conspiracy had lost control of a key, irrefutable witness. Crawford pulled out his phone, his fingers flying across the keypad. "We have a problem. The Hutchkins asset wasn't neutralized as reported. He's at the mine site with a county deputy. Dispatch a cleanup team immediately." Danny's heart sank. More people were going to die because of his investigation. "You know what the real tragedy is, Sheriff?" Crawford said, putting away his phone, a chilling calm settling over him once more. "Your grandfather actually succeeded in hiding evidence that could have exposed this operation 50 years ago. If you just left it alone, those 17 families might have gotten justice eventually. But now, because of your interference, we'll have to expand the cover-up and eliminate additional witnesses. Including me," he said, gesturing to himself. "Including you, including Mr. Patterson, including your deputy, and including Mr. Hutchkins." Crawford's eyes then flickered to Danny, a cruel final twist of the knife. "And, unfortunately, including your parents, who received classified information during your investigation." Danny's blood turned to ice, a cold, searing rage igniting within him. "My parents don't know anything," he roared. "They know enough," Crawford corrected, his voice flat. "Federal agents visited them. They heard you discussing classified matters. They could become problems in the future."
That's when Danny made a decision that would either save innocent lives or get everyone killed. He grabbed one of the geological sample bags from his grandfather's safety deposit box, a small, heavy cloth bag, and threw it as hard as he could at the nearest light fixture. The vault plunged into darkness just as Danny dove behind a row of safety deposit boxes, pulling Patterson with him. Gunfire erupted in the confined space, muzzle flashes strobing like lightning as Crawford's tactical team, momentarily disoriented, tried to locate their targets in the sudden gloom. But Danny had one crucial advantage. He knew exactly where the circuit breaker panel was located, having noticed it when they first entered the vault. In 15 seconds, he was going to find out if 50 years of careful planning and calculated murder could be undone by a small-town sheriff with his grandfather's evidence and a whole lot of luck. The question was whether he'd live long enough to get that evidence to the outside world.
Denny crawled through the oppressive darkness toward where he remembered seeing the circuit breaker panel, dragging the terrified Patterson behind him. The tactical team's flashlight beams cut through the vault like frantic searchlights, and Danny could hear Crawford coordinating their movements in harsh, urgent whispers. "Thermal imaging shows 2 heat signatures behind the east wall of boxes," one of the agents reported, his voice tight. "Moving to flank." Danny reached the circuit panel and felt along the cold concrete wall until his fingers found the rough metal box. He yanked it open and without hesitation started flipping breakers, hoping to kill power to the entire building and perhaps trigger some kind of external alarm system. The vault went completely, utterly dark as even the emergency lighting died. "Building power is down," Crawford's voice echoed, disoriented in the absolute blackness. "Switch to night vision and end this."
But Danny had bought himself maybe 30 precious seconds, and he used every one of them to grab Patterson and scramble toward the vault's rear wall, where he'd noticed a service door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." Behind them, he could hear the tactical team moving with military precision, their night vision equipment giving them a huge, terrifying advantage in the darkness. Danny found the service door, frantically tried the handle. Locked. "Patterson," he whispered, his voice strained, "do you have keys to this door?" "It leads to the old pneumatic tube system," Patterson whispered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "We don't use it anymore, but it connects to the drive-through teller window. Can we get through it?" "Maybe, but it's a tight fit," Patterson replied, his voice trembling.
Danny could hear the tactical team getting closer, their heavy boots scuffing on the concrete floor. In a few seconds, they'd have clear shots at both of them. He pulled out his service weapon and fired 3 rapid shots at the service door lock. The muzzle flashes temporarily blinded anyone with night vision equipment. The doors sprang open, revealing a narrow, claustrophobic maintenance corridor that smelled of dust and old grease. "Go!" Danny hissed, shoving Patterson into the dark, narrow passage ahead of him. They crawled, desperately, through a space barely wide enough for their shoulders, following a path that Danny hoped, prayed, led to some kind of exit. Behind them, he could hear Crawford's team breaking through the now damaged service door, their shouts echoing ominously. "They're in the pneumatic system!" Crawford's voice boomed through the narrow corridor, magnified and distorted. "Seal all exits and flood the tubes with gas!" Danny's heart sank. They were trapped in a confined space, armed federal agents behind them, and poison gas ahead. But then, Patterson grabbed his arm, his fingers digging in. "There!" he whispered, pointing to a faint, rectangular sliver of light ahead of them. "The drive-through window!"
They crawled faster, fueled by terror and a desperate surge of adrenaline, Danny's knees scraping painfully against the metal tube walls. Behind them, he could hear the distinct, terrifying hiss of gas being released into the system. Danny reached the drive-through window first and kicked out the pneumatic tube cover with a desperate, guttural cry, sending it flying into the parking lot outside. Fresh, cold air rushed into the suffocating corridor, and Danny hauled himself through the opening, then pulled Patterson out after him. They were outside the bank, blinking in the dim light of dawn, but Danny could immediately see federal agents positioned strategically around the building perimeter. Crawford's team had the entire area locked down, a net tightening around them. "This way!" Patterson gasped, pointing toward a narrow alley that ran between the bank and the adjacent hardware store. "My car is parked behind the building!" They ran for the alley, keeping low, their breath ragged, but Danny knew they had mere seconds before Crawford's people spotted them. He still had his grandfather's evidence stuffed inside his jacket, the documents crackling against his skin, but it wouldn't do any good if they were both killed before they could get it to the media. That's when Danny heard the distinct thrumming sound of helicopters approaching. But these weren't federal helicopters. As they got closer, circling overhead, Danny could clearly make out news station logos on their sides. "How the hell?" Patterson gasped, his eyes wide with disbelief.
Danny's radio had been destroyed, but Patterson's phone, miraculously, had been recording everything Crawford had said about killing law enforcement officers and covering up mass murder. Even though the upload had failed, the local recording was still intact, a digital testament to the truth. And apparently, someone, somewhere, had been listening.
The first helicopter to touch down in the bank's parking lot bore the unmistakable insignia of WCHS-TV in Charleston. A news crew, a whirlwind of motion and purpose, spilled out, cameras already rolling, capturing every frantic detail. The federal agents suddenly exposed, the heavily sealed bank building, and then, emerging from a darkened alley, Sheriff Danny Morrison, a lone figure clutching evidence of a 50-year conspiracy.
"Sheriff Morrison!" a reporter shouted, her voice cutting through the helicopter's thrum. "Channel 8 News. We received reports of federal agents shooting at local law enforcement. Can you comment?" Crawford, his face a mask of incandescent rage, appeared at the bank's entrance. But with news cameras rolling and helicopters circling overhead like metallic vultures, he couldn't simply execute Danny and Patterson in broad daylight. The rules of the game had abruptly, decisively changed. "Those men are federal fugitives," Crawford bellowed, his voice straining against the rotor wash. "They're in possession of stolen classified materials." "What classified materials?" the reporter shot back, her microphone thrust forward. "What's this about a mining conspiracy?"
Danny realized this was his chance, the narrow, improbable window of opportunity he'd been fighting for. With live television cameras bearing witness, Crawford, for all his power and ruthless efficiency, couldn't stop him from telling the truth. "My name is Sheriff Danny Morrison of Mingo County," he called out, his voice firm, resonating with a lifetime of quiet integrity. He pulled his grandfather's letter, now a precious, fragile testament, from his jacket, holding it aloft. "I have evidence that federal agents murdered 17 coal miners in 1962 to cover up the theft of rare earth elements worth over $10 billion. The news crew surged forward, a hungry wave of microphones and lenses. Cameras focused intently on Danny as he held up the documents, his hands steady despite the tremor in his soul. "This letter was written by my grandfather, James Patrick Morrison, the night before he was murdered by federal contractors. It documents a conspiracy involving the illegal extraction of strategic minerals and the systematic elimination of civilian witnesses." Crawford was shouting frantically into his radio, his commands lost in the growing din, probably calling for backup or desperate air support. But it was too late. The story was already going live on television, carried on the airwaves, echoing across the nation. More helicopters were arriving, a mix of state police choppers, additional news crews, and what looked like genuine FBI agents, their presence a stark contrast to Crawford's shadowy operatives, responding to reports of rogue federal actions. Danny's phone, which he'd somehow managed to keep hold of during the frantic escape from the bank vault, suddenly rang. The caller ID showed Deputy Williams. "Sheriff, are you all right?" Williams's voice, crackling with urgency, came through the line. "I'm watching you on the news right now." "Williams, where are you?" "Still at the Blackwater mine with Carl Hutchkins. Sheriff, you need to know. We opened the sealed mine entrance. There are bodies down there. 17 bodies, still in their work clothes, all with gunshot wounds." Danny felt a profound, gut-wrenching mix of vindication and horror. "Are you recording everything?" "Video, photos, everything. But Sheriff, there's something else. Hutchkins says there are documents hidden in the mine that prove this conspiracy goes way beyond Blackwater. He says there are dozens of other sites, hundreds of other victims."
Danny looked at Crawford, who was now surrounded by state police officers and a swarm of reporters, his federal authority dissolving under the glare of public scrutiny. The federal agent's career,
and likely his freedom, were over. But the conspiracy he represented was much, much larger than one isolated operation.
Williams, secure that crime scene and don't let anyone near it except state police investigators, Danny commanded, his voice clear and resolute. And get Hutchkins somewhere safe. These people have been killing witnesses for 50 years. Already done, Sheriff. State police are en route, and I've got Hutchkins in protective custody. Danny hung up and turned to face the news cameras again, the weight of a half-century of silence resting on his shoulders. With the world watching, he was going to expose every chilling detail of the Blackwater Mine conspiracy, to challenge the federal government to explain 50 years of murder and cover-ups. But as he began reading his grandfather's letter aloud on live television, his voice echoing across the parking lot and into countless homes, Danny knew this was just the beginning. Crawford had mentioned dozens of other mining operations, hundreds of other victims, and a conspiracy that reached the highest, most shadowed levels of government. The Blackwater Mine murders were about to become the single thread that, once pulled, would unravel one of the longest-running cover-ups in American history. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., very powerful people were, at that very moment, probably making frantic decisions about how to contain the damage before it utterly destroyed careers, decimated corporations, and brought down government agencies that had been built on 50 years of stolen resources and murdered witnesses. The terrifying question, the one that lingered in the still morning air, was whether Danny Morrison would live long enough to see justice finally delivered for his grandfather and the 16 other men who had died trying to protect the truth.
6 months after the Blackwater Mine story broke, Danny Morrison stood at the entrance to what had once been a sealed tomb and was now the most extensively investigated crime scene in West Virginia history. The FBI, now operating with genuine federal authority and a new sense of purpose, had meticulously recovered the remains of 16 miners from the suffocating depths of the mine. His grandfather's body, however, was never found, leading investigators to grimly believe James Morrison had been buried elsewhere after his murder, his resting place a final, cruel secret. Each victim, when examined by forensic teams, showed undeniable evidence of execution-style gunshot wounds, exactly as Carl Hutchkins had described witnessing 50 years earlier. But the bodies were just the chilling beginning of what they found. Hidden in a cleverly reinforced chamber deep within the mine, a testament to James Morrison's defiant foresight, were boxes upon boxes of documents he had secretly stashed away before his death. Contracts, thick with legal jargon and shadowy clauses, between various government agencies and private mining companies. Detailed lists of other containment operations spread across Appalachia, a horrifying network of similar crimes. And geological surveys, stark and irrefutable, identifying billions of dollars worth of rare earth elements that had been extracted under the chilling guise of national security. The paper trail, meticulously reconstructed, led investigators to mining operations in Kentucky, Pennsylvania, Virginia, and Tennessee, where similar accidents had systematically eliminated civilian witnesses to classified extraction programs. In total, investigators identified over 300 miners and their family members who had been murdered or disappeared over 8 decades of covert resource operations, a hidden genocide for profit.
Danny walked through the mine's main tunnel, now brightly lit with industrial lighting, no longer a place of shadow and death, but a bustling hive of activity. Forensic investigators in their sterile suits, journalists with their notebooks and cameras, and congressional staff members, their faces grim, were preparing for hearings that would expose the full, horrifying scope of the conspiracy to the American people. Carl Hutchkins, no longer a terrified hermit hiding in the shadows, had become the star witness in what media outlets were now universally calling the Blackwater hearings. His harrowing testimony about witnessing the 1962 murders, delivered with a quiet, steely resolve, had corroborated every single detail in James Morrison's hidden documents. And his 50 years of careful observation, his decades of silent vigil,
had helped investigators identify other surviving witnesses who had been forced into hiding, living under assumed names across the country, finally able to step forward and tell their truths. "Sheriff Morrison?" Danny turned to see Congressman Michael Torres, the newly appointed chairman of the House Committee investigating the mining conspiracy, approaching him. Torres, a man of gravitas and unshakable principle, had flown in from Washington to personally examine the crime scene, to feel the weight of history in the cold, damp air of the mine. "Congressman," Danny said, shaking the man's hand firmly, "thank you for coming." "Thank you for having the courage to expose this," Torres replied, his gaze sweeping across the grim scene. "Do you realize what you've uncovered here? This isn't just about mining operations. The rare earth elements stolen from sites like Blackwater have been the very foundation of American electronics and weapons technology for decades. Cell phones, satellites, guided missiles, all of it built on resources that were literally stolen at gunpoint from American communities." Danny nodded grimly, the words catching in his throat. "And paid for with American lives." They walked deeper into the mine, past the stark evidence markers where investigators had found bullet casings, personal belongings, and the crude, desperate barricades the miners had built in their final, futile attempt to defend themselves. The air grew colder, heavier with the ghosts of the past. "What's the status of the prosecutions?" Danny asked, hoping for some measure of tangible justice. Torres's expression darkened. "Mixed results. Agent Crawford and his immediate team are facing federal murder charges, and we expect convictions, but some of the higher-level officials involved have claimed immunity based on national security classifications. We're fighting those claims in court, but it's going to be a long, arduous battle." "And the mining companies?" "That's where we're having more success. Cumberland Coal Company, which is now part of a major international corporation, is facing wrongful death lawsuits from the families of all 17 Blackwater victims and hundreds of others. The rare earth elements extracted from this site alone are worth an estimated $12 billion in today's market. The families are finally going to be compensated, Sheriff. Finally." Danny stopped at the exact spot where investigators believed his grandfather had made his final heroic stand. Someone had left flowers there, fresh daisies, their vibrant white and yellow a stark contrast to the darkness, looking like they'd been placed only moments ago. "The other mining sites," Danny said, his voice quiet. "How many families are we talking about?" "Over 800 confirmed victims across 6 states, Torres replied, his voice heavy with the enormity of it. "And we're still identifying more as witnesses bravely come forward. Some of these people have been living under assumed identities for 30 or 40 years, too terrified to contact their original families, believing them to be dead or gone."
Danny thought about the staggering scope of the conspiracy. Decades of systematic murder, entire communities destroyed, families torn apart and erased from history, all to steal natural resources that belonged, unequivocally, to the American people. "Congressman," Danny said, his gaze fixed on the quiet memorial of flowers, "what guarantees do we have that this won't happen again?" Torres pulled a thick, official-looking folder from his briefcase. "This is legislation we're introducing next month, the James Morrison Transparency Act. It will require congressional oversight of all federal resource extraction operations, mandate public disclosure of geological surveys on federal lands, and establish robust protection programs for civilian witnesses to government operations." "Named after my grandfather?" "Named after all of them," Torres corrected, his voice tinged with respect. "James Morrison, Carl Hutchkins, and every single person who had the courage to preserve evidence and tell the truth despite unimaginable threats to their lives. They emerged from the mine into the crisp afternoon sunlight, where Danny could see tourists, no longer just journalists, but ordinary citizens still gathering, drawn to document the site where one of America's longest-running and most heinous conspiracies had finally been exposed. His phone buzzed with a text message from his father. "Watching the congressional hearings on C-SPAN, your grandfather would be proud."
Danny smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile for the first time in what felt like forever. His parents had returned from Charleston after Crawford's arrest, and while the Federal Protection Program had relocated them to a secure location while the investigation continued, the daily threats and chilling surveillance were over. The conspiracy had been too thoroughly exposed, too irrevocably dragged into the light to continue operating in the shadows. Sheriff Morrison, a young woman, approached them, her notebook held eagerly in hand. "I'm Jennifer Walsh from the Washington Post. I'm working on a book about the Blackwater conspiracy. Could I ask you a few questions?" Danny had given hundreds of interviews over the past 6 months, his face now instantly recognizable across the nation. But he still found it surreal that his grandfather's meticulously hidden evidence had become the undeniable basis for congressional investigations, federal prosecutions, and now books detailing decades of government cover-ups. "What do you want to know? What made you decide to keep investigating, even after federal agents threatened your life and the lives of your family?" Danny thought about the question for a moment, his gaze drifting back toward the mine entrance where 17 men and countless others had died trying to protect the truth. He thought about his grandfather's letter, the last desperate message from a brave man. "I think about my grandfather's letter," he said, his voice reflective. "The last thing he wrote was, 'Use this evidence to get justice. Use it to expose the conspiracy, and use it to make sure no other families have to suffer what ours has suffered.' That's not just advice. That's a responsibility that got passed down through 50 years of secrecy. And now those 17 families finally know the truth about how their loved ones died. Now the people responsible are facing justice. And now we have protections in place to make sure government agencies can't murder American citizens to steal their natural resources." Jennifer Walsh scribbled notes furiously, her pen flying across the page. "Do you think justice has been served?" Danny considered the question, letting the weight of it settle. Crawford and his team were facing life sentences. The mining companies were paying billions in reparations, a staggering sum that would finally compensate the ravaged families. Congress was diligently investigating the full scope of the conspiracy and implementing sweeping oversight reforms. But 17 men were still dead. Hundreds of other victims would never see justice in its fullest form. And some of the highest-level officials responsible for ordering the murders had, for now, escaped prosecution by cynically claiming national security immunity. "Justice is being served," Danny said finally, his gaze once more on the silent, scarred earth of the mine. "But it's not complete. It may never be complete. The best we can do is make sure the truth is known and prevent it from ever happening again." As the reporter walked away, her mind clearly buzzing with the story, Danny's radio crackled with a call from dispatch. "Sheriff Morrison, we've got a situation developing at the county courthouse. Large crowd gathering for the memorial service." Danny smiled. Today was the dedication of the James Morrison Memorial, a simple, dignified monument honoring all 17 victims of the Blackwater mine murders. Families from across the country, some meeting for the first time, were gathering to remember loved ones who had been missing, tragically and unjustly, for 50 years, finally able to mourn properly and celebrate their courage, their defiance. "On my way," Danny replied, a sense of quiet purpose settling over him.
As he drove back toward Matewan, the winding mountain roads now feeling less like a trap and more like a path forward, Danny reflected on everything that had changed since he'd found that dusty file in the county archives. The town, once a forgotten speck on the map, had become a solemn pilgrimage site for people interested in government accountability and corporate transparency. Property values had unexpectedly increased as historians, journalists, and documentarians moved to the area, eager to research the conspiracy. Most importantly, families that had been scattered, traumatized, and silenced for decades were finally reconnecting, finally healing, finally finding their voices.
At the courthouse, Danny found hundreds of people gathered around a simple granite memorial that listed, in stark, elegant script, the names of all 17 Blackwater victims. But what moved him most was seeing Carl Hutchkin standing there, beside the memorial, no longer in hiding, his weathered face streaked with tears, finally able to openly honor the men he'd watched die 50 years ago. "Sheriff," Hutchkin said as Danny approached, his voice thick with emotion, "thank you for finishing what your grandfather started." "Thank you for preserving the evidence that made it possible," Danny replied, the bond between them forged in shared truth and hardship. They stood together in silence for a moment, reading the names carved into the cool granite. James Patrick Morrison was listed first, identified simply as lead foreman and truth keeper. Danny's phone buzzed with another message, this one from a number he didn't immediately recognize. "Sheriff Morrison, my name is Patricia Collins. My father was Deputy R. Collins, who tried to investigate the Blackwater murders in 1962. I have documents my father hid before he was killed in that car accident. I think you'll want to see them." Danny stared at the message, a sudden, profound realization washing over him. Even 6 months after exposing the Blackwater conspiracy, after all the hearings and investigations and revelations, there were still secrets waiting to be uncovered, still witnesses ready to come forward, still evidence hidden away by people who had, against all odds, refused to let the truth die with them. The fight for justice would continue. But today, right here, right now, 17 miners who had died trying to protect their community were finally being honored for their courage. And James Patrick Morrison's grandson was, in every meaningful way, carrying on the family tradition of refusing to let powerful people bury the truth. Danny Morrison looked up at the memorial one more time, a silent promise in his eyes, then walked toward his patrol car to respond to Patricia Collins's message. After 50 years, the Blackwater mine conspiracy was over, but somewhere in America, there were probably other mines, other victims, and other secrets that needed a small-town sheriff with his grandfather's unshakable sense of justice to bring them into the light. Danny Morrison was ready for whatever came next.